The hearing will come to order. Before we begin, I know many of us in the budget community are mourning the loss of Alice Rivlin, the founding director of the Congressional Budget Office, whose groundbreaking career also included stints as the director of OMB and vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board, among many other roles. Alice was widely respected and revered by Democrats and Republicans alike for her work and vision, her warmth and compassion, and her contributions will continue to help frame our debates for years to come. I think I speak for everyone in this room when I say that Alice Rivlin will be deeply missed and that we send our condolences to her family and loved ones. Now, good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on keeping our promise to America's seniors, retirement security in the 21st century. Today's hearing will include two panels, and I'd like to thank our great panelists for being here with us today. In our first panel, we will be hearing brief remarks from our friend, the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee for House Ways and Means. And for our second panel, we will be hearing from Dr. Melissa Favreau, senior fellow at the Urban Institute, Mr. James Dale Hanner, secretary-treasurer of the North Carolina Committee to Protect Pensions, Dr. Andrew Biggs, resident scholar at the America Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to ask Mr. Morelli to note our final panelist, who I understand is joining us today from Mr. Morelli's district. Mr. Morelli, I yield to you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so pleased to welcome to this esteemed committee my dear friend Anne-Marie Cooke. Anne-Marie serves as the president and CEO of Lifespan of Greater Rochester, a local not-for-profit that provides critical support services for the aging population in my district and across New York State. For over 2 decades, she has helped older residents and their caregivers to navigate long-term care options, help with health insurance options under Medicare, assist in elder abuse situations, and so much more. Truly grateful for her friendship, for her partnership, and her dedication to ensuring a high quality of life for those in their later years. Our committee will no doubt benefit greatly from her knowledge and expertise in today's testimony, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce Anne-Marie to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli. Once again, I'd like to welcome Chairman Larson and our witnesses. Thank you all for joining us. And now I yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. As we know, keeping our promise of secure retirement to American workers while maintaining our nation's fiscal health is one of our greatest policy challenges. Social Security is facing a shortfall. Traditional employer-sponsored pensions are disappearing. And due to stagnant wages and income inequality, far too many Americans cannot afford to save for retirement. Americans are also living longer. Our birth rate is declining, and our population is skewing older. This perfect storm of changing demographics and its inescapable mathematical reality threaten to upend the promise of a secure retirement for millions of Americans, and the problem grows more pressing by the day. By 2035, Americans aged 65 years and older will outnumber children under the age of 18 for the first time in history. More than 63 million Americans are already receiving Social Security benefits, and every day, an additional 10,000 baby boomers reach eligibility. As a result, this bulwark program is facing serious long-term funding shortfalls, with promised benefits facing cuts as high as 20% as soon as 2035 if Congress does not act. Cuts of this level would be devastating for the individuals who rely on Social Security. Since its inception in 1935, the program has been a pillar of retirement security, but it was never meant to be seniors' primary source of income. However, today, half of seniors receive at least half of their income from Social Security, and 1/5 receive 90% or more of their income from the program. But it's not just those who rely on Social Security who are in jeopardy. In today's unreliable retirement landscape, even those hardworking Americans who have a pension are now at risk of losing their hard-earned benefits. In my home state of Kentucky, pensions for teachers and other state employees are under attack by our governor, who believes the people who educate our children are, quote, selfish for wanting the retirement they earned. Multi-employer pension programs throughout the country are unable to pay out at their promised rates. I've met with truck drivers from my district whose pensions will be cut by 60% or more if Congress doesn't step in. These are all American workers who planned for their retirement and contributed to their pensions instead of taking home more pay. Now, after working for decades, their planned retirements may vanish. However, the causes of this problem go even deeper than changing demographics and retirement programs. According to Federal Reserve economists, on average, the bottom 90% of American households have been unable to recover the wealth they lost during the Great Recession. Wage gaps and systemic income inequality are unfairly capping lifetime earnings and savings opportunities for millions of American workers, particularly women and minorities. White retirees are almost twice as likely as Black and Latino retirees to have private retirement savings and are significantly more likely to have savings through an IRA or 401k retirement account. Longer life expectancies and gender pay disparities make women more economically vulnerable than men, with women aged 65 and over being 80% more likely to be impoverished than their male counterparts. Meeting this fiscal challenge will require a clear-eyed acceptance of the demographic realities and a willingness to responsibly raise more revenue over time. Immigration reform could make significant inroads in alleviating some of our demographic challenges. It is also likely the only realistic solution for addressing lower birth rates, which slow the growth of our labor force and economy and put even greater pressure on federal budgets. I hope to discuss immigration today, but we'll definitely review it in detail at an upcoming hearing on the issue. It's also important to note that the Trump tax cuts enacted last year have made this situation more complicated. These tax cuts blew a massive $1.9 trillion hole in our deficits, and as a result, our Republican colleagues have called for extreme cuts to insurance programs, including Social Security and Medicare. These proposed cuts and the entire Trump budget were dead on arrival to Congress, thankfully, but they highlight how far apart Democrats and Republicans are when it comes to protecting Social Security and earned benefits. Congress has a responsibility to act and honor the promise of retirement security, but we have a long way to go before we can enact the smart and multifaceted approaches that can close the retirement gap without sacrificing our nation's fiscal health or harming current or future retirees. It is my hope that this hearing will help advance that process. Once again, I thank our witnesses for helping us with the discussion, and I look forward to their testimony. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Womack.
I thank the chairman and appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to hear from our witnesses. Strengthening retirement security for today's seniors and families, as well as future generations, is a goal that I think we all share. The question is on how we get there, especially at a time, as the chairman so appropriately stated, that we've got 10,000 people a day aging into these programs, and they're all living a lot longer, which I think is a good thing. But let's start with Social Security. Not only is it one of the biggest parts of our federal budget, making up 24% of all federal spending, it's also a primary source of retirement income for millions of Americans. We've all seen the data, we've read the headlines, the program is in trouble. As more Americans become eligible for Social Security benefits, and as Americans live longer, fewer Americans are entering the workforce and paying into the program. Over time, that means the money Social Security spends on benefits will outpace the revenue it brings in through the collection of payroll taxes. At its current rate, the program will only be able to pay 3/4 of the benefits retirees were promised by the year 2035. I agree with my friends across the aisle. That is certainly unacceptable. It's our responsibility in Congress to prevent these across-the-board benefit cuts and make sure this important program can continue and work better for workers and retirees today and for generations to come. As America's demographics have evolved, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have worked together on 4 separate occasions to pass structural reforms to improve the program. Most recently, in 1983, Congress passed legislation to gradually increase the retirement age from 65 to 67. That was a common-sense bipartisan idea to address the fact that Americans are living roughly 15 years longer today than they were when Social Security was first created in 1935. I'm committed to working together to uphold the history of bipartisan Social Security reform. One thing is certain, punishing today's workers and job creators with enormous tax hikes is not a solution. That approach would drag down our economy and penalize Americans for working hard, hurting millennials and small business employees the most. When it comes to Social Security, we should focus on rewarding work while targeting benefits to help vulnerable Americans. We can also strengthen retirement security for all Americans by continuing to promote policies that fuel our economy. While the chairman took a stab at the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I think it's safe to say that we would disagree that I do believe that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act have inspired a lot of people to enter the workforce, and that can't be a problem for the collection of the payroll taxes that strengthen Social Security. With more jobs, record low unemployment, record high wage gains, and a growing economy, workers and families are able to save and invest more for their future. That's not only led to record high contributions, it's also led to increased optimism. A recent CNBC poll found that a majority of Americans are feeling more confident about saving for retirement today than they felt 3 years ago. And in a survey conducted by the Federal Reserve, 75% of retirees believe they have enough retirement income to maintain their standard of living. We should focus on solutions that build on this progress and help even more Americans save. For example, the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act of 2019, known as SECURE, introduced by bipartisan leaders on the Ways and Means Committee, would strengthen retirement security by encouraging job creators of all sizes to offer full and part-time employees more retirement options. I look forward to exploring more bipartisan solutions like this today. And with that, I thank you again for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member, and as we usually do, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Welcome, Chairman Larson. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. You may begin
Well,
when
thank
you're
you,
ready.
Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack for the opportunity to come before the distinguished Budget Committee. As you indicated, we have written testimony, and what I like to do is deviate from that because of, in both of your opening remarks, you covered a lot of the ground that I would go over. I would add, in fact, that while, and you're right to say that this is keeping our promise to American seniors is first and foremost, the Ways and Means Committee has already unanimously adopted the SECURE Act that Mr. Womack alluded to, and legislation also that would require automatic enrollment for employees. Bipartisanly, Rich Neal is heading up leading legislation addressing multi-employer pension crisis that we face with a number of pieces of legislation. I would also add that we want to go through these things and address them in a bipartisan fashion. And we think we have legislation that is increasingly, because we haven't had hearings in 8 years, we think the legislation here is drawing critical masses of the required individuals that we need. This is our responsibility at the end of the day. The last time that Congress truly looked at this program was 36 years ago. And when they did it bipartisanly with, at the time, a reluctant Republican president, but one who became a chief advocate. And Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan get a lot of credit for bringing people together, but I would point out also that the Republicans controlled the Senate at that time also, and Howard Baker was the United States Senator. What's at stake here? What's at stake here is the nation's leading insurance program and the nation's leading anti-poverty program. Without this program and the direction that we're headed in, by 2035, we would find ourselves in a situation where people who have earned $50,000 in income throughout their lives would face a 20% across-the-board cut and would be living below the poverty level. It's our responsibility. We're the actuaries. It's an insurance program. The public knows this because it says, they look at their pay stub and it says FICA. What does that mean? Federal Insurance Contribution Act. Whose contribution? Theirs. And approximately every one of us has approximately 100,000 more in districts, depending on how it is, people who are currently on Social Security. It's our responsibility to make sure that the program is actuarially sound. I don't know how any member can go back to their district, look people in the eyes, including your mothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles, and say, with our responsibility, when on our watch, knowing everything that we do and knowing, as both the chairman and ranking member have outlined, what our responsibility is, that we chose not to act. This has also become the civil rights issue of the day. It's also become a woman's issue of the day and an economic development issue of the day. I talk about that in my testimony, but I just want to briefly underscore how we see the disadvantages that take place for women of color, for black men who find themselves with mortality rates and the inability to collect on monies that they've put forward into this program, and why across-the-board cuts or hikes by raising the age of individuals. It just turned 66. It's hiked. It will go up to 67. Another hike beyond that for every year that we add is a 7% cut. And with so many individuals depending upon Social Security, it's paramount that this Congress, faced with our responsibility, takes the action that it needs. We have legislation that's out there. We have introduced it with more than 200 co-sponsors. What we need is now the bipartisan support. It will pass the House of Representatives. There's no question about that. And I want to commend the President of the United States for first taking a bold stand in a presidential debate when it really mattered, in saying this isn't an entitlement, this is an earned benefit. Now it's time for us to all come together and work collaboratively so that we save this program and enhance it the way it should be. Happy to take your questions.
Any member want to ask Chairman Larson a question? Great. We thank the chairman for his testimony and his insights, and we appreciate your being here today.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
Chairman.
very much.
You didn't even give me a chance to go into my Starbucks, and these are my stump speech props that I have, but I would point out and like to submit for the record the Chief Actuary of Social Security. We have the only bill that has been deemed by the actuary to be sufficiently solvent. That meets the requirement by law that is our responsibility to sustain the program beyond 75 years.
All right. Ranking member has a question.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh.
just a point of clarity. You asked if anybody wanted to ask any questions. Was in addition to our 5 minutes you're going to give us later?
Just one question.
Well, one question is that, just for a point of clarity for the record, the 21% that we're going to see in 2035 affects all people, not just, you had mentioned it was a civil rights issue and a woman's issue, but it's all people's issues.
It is all people's issues, the 20% across the board, but currently, under current law, you have 5 million Americans. There's 62 million Americans who are on Social Security currently, 5 million of whom are living below the poverty level. Part of what we hope to do is to make sure that we both create a new floor for Social Security so that especially women who, because they are the primary caregivers, and today with 74% of them in the workforce, find themselves, because they were earning 80 cents for every dollar their male counterparts were, and because they spent less time, because they were the caregivers, find themselves in poverty. In fact, close to 3 million women across this country who have paid in all their quarters, worked all their lives, are living in poverty in the wealthiest nation in the world. And this is an actuarial problem that is easily resolved by Congress. I ask any member of this body, have any of your insurance premiums gone up since 1983? You have the responsibility. If you were a business, if you were an insurance company, I happen to be from an insurance capital of the nation and had an insurance business as well. You know, you would make those adjustments and raise those costs. Had they indexed it the way they should have in 1983, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. And Social Security has never missed a payment. But thank you for that question. It's a great point because this will impact all individuals. But when you look currently how this disproportionately impacts women and men of color because of their particular financial situation, it's time for us to act.
Thank you for the clarity.
Thank you. Gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, has a question. Oh, did you have one?
I think you're fishing for me to ask you about your Starbucks reference, Mr. Chairman, so I was going to just give you the chance to do that.
Well, everybody always asks, well, how are you going to pay for this? Well, we pay for it by making sure that we do what they should have done in 1983. We have incremental funding. We increase it approximately by 1.2%, the contribution. And as you know, the contribution is made by the employee and the employer. The employer gets to write it off as taxes. The employee not only gets a pension benefit, but also, and we don't discuss this enough, a disability payment, spousal and dependent coverage. There is no place in the public market as a former insurance agent that you can go and buy this. It's the full faith and credit of the United States government. We also lift the cap on people over $400,000, and that's where the Starbucks comes in. At every seniors center I go to, I say, how much is this Starbucks cost? And they all will say, is it a latte? And I go, yes. They go, $4.50. They go, that's correct. Or, under our plan, if you're making $50,000 a year, this is 9 weeks of Social Security payments. And even if you're that poor person at $400,000, it will cost you more to buy a latte than it will to fix Social Security. We can do this. Had they incrementally phased this in and indexed it back in 1983, we wouldn't be having this discussion. They didn't. We're the stewards of this program. It's our responsibility to do this, and we can fix a major problem. Again, let me credit the president for sticking his neck out on this one as well.
Ranking member has a question.
You know, one of the great frustrations I have as a member of Congress is the fact that the varsity sport of Congress is a game called kicking the can down the road.
Exactly.
And we're really good at it. I mean, we don't have a rival in this notion that when confronted with a problem like we have with Social Security, or even more urgent, in my view, is the problem with the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, which is about 10 years ahead of Social Security in terms of insolvency. That it seems as though we do not decide to take effective action until we're on the cliff. And need I remind anybody of the cliffhanger that we had in 2012 and 13 on the Bush-era tax cuts, that we waited until the very last minute, in fact, beyond the last minute. But I digress. I think the people of America, while there's anecdotal evidence out there that they understand that we have a problem, but the problem is not tomorrow. The problem is 2035. And it seems as though Congress is okay with deciding we're going to deal with this when it becomes a real matter of urgency, like 2033 or 2034. And it seems to me that whenever you delay the eventual that long, that your options become fewer and further between, and they become much more draconian in their nature. So I don't know if I've got so much of a question as just a comment along those themes that I'll throw back at you, Congressman Larson, for any response you'd care to make.
Well, I couldn't agree more with you. And also, I would point out, and I do so in my testimony, how it's also said, well, you know, this problem, you know, is, you know, we're going to be okay until 2035. And also that, well, this is just a shifting from one generation to another. No, it's not. In fact, millennials are going to need Social Security more than baby boomers will need Social Security. It's long overdue for boomers and millennials to unite and talk about something that's within our grasp and something that we can solve, and do so pragmatically, in a common sense manner, and address it in a business-like manner, the same way any actuarial would do that. Now, unique feature here is that every single thing that we call for in these enhancements has been already, by the independent actuary, said not only is it paid for, but it is sustainable beyond 75 years. Wouldn't it be great on our watch to take this off Congress's plate and to go home and be able to look everyone in the eye and say, not only did we fix this, we fixed it for, by law as we're required, beyond 75 years, and we enhanced it. We won't allow for anyone who's paid their quarters in to retire into poverty. We won't see women of color have the, to find themselves impoverished even though they've worked all their lives and paid in their quarters. And so it just seems to me that there's ample opportunity. And again, it took President Reagan and Tip O'Neill coming together. And most people forget that Howard Baker was the Senate chairman at that time. So it's the identical situation that we are confronted with here today. Tip had a few more Democrats at that time than we do today, but I think the situation warrants, especially with the president being predisposed to do this and have talked and written in his book about this as being an earned benefit. But thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, has a question.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Republican Leader Womack for holding today's hearing. Chairman Larson, I appreciate you being here. Mr. Womack talked about the blood sport of kicking the sport of kicking the can down the road that Congress has gotten pretty good at. The other thing that we've gotten really good at is the blood sport of condemning each other when either side tries to touch the third rail of policy in this town, and Social Security is certainly one of those. And I remember back in 2011 when I was a freshman member of the Budget Committee, we put up a plan to try to save Medicare for all generations. And within 36 hours, there was an ad of somebody pushed a wheelchair that threw Granny over the cliff, and that somebody was that looked like a lot like Paul Ryan, who was then the budget chair. So I agree with you. We're going to have to hold hands and do this in a bipartisan manner. There's some things about your bill I like. There's some things about your bill that I think could benefit from some bipartisan support. And so I hope that that's something that we can do moving forward. As we're all aware, the 2019 Social Security Trustees Report offered a grim outlook on the current path. Social Security will run deficits of nearly $1.8 trillion over the next 10 years, and benefits will face 20% reductions by 2035. That means today's 51-year-olds will face cuts when they reach retirement age, and today's newest retirees will face cuts when they turn 78. So it's important to note that the average new retiree lives to age 85. And so we don't do anything, as you were pretty eloquent in saying, Social Security is going to become insolvent, and everyday Americans are going to hurt. So again, we've got to grab hands and work on this, but it's got to be bipartisan. So I'm hopeful that you're willing to do that. I do have to add some additional context to some of the things that the chairman said in his opening statements. One, wage growth is not flat or stagnant now. The last quarter's wage growth was up 3.2%, and there were some comments about income inequality. The bottom 10%, income in the bottom 10% of Americans in the last quarter grew by 6.6%, over double of what the average population did. So the tax cuts, the economic reforms that we proposed are truly lifting all boats and reducing the income inequality that exploded over the last several years before that. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Well, I would just add that, thank you for the comments. I'd add also that Tom Reed has been outstanding. And I think, let's be blunt about it, I think what people don't like about the program is how we pay for it. And, but at the end of the day, we're faced with two options. Either you raise the age, which again, let's be honest about it, that's a cut in benefits to people that we're finding, and both the Republican leader and the chairman eloquently stated what the deal is here in terms of these people and what they'll receive. And, you know, for them to be looking at, for many of them, for almost 90% of people who haven't recovered from the 2008 recession, then to find themselves in a situation where we're either going to hike the age where they get another cut in the benefit, that for whatever the reason, their inability to save, their companies no longer, I mean, there's no such thing anymore as defined benefit plans. We all know that, and we should be doing everything that we could to encourage all three legs of the stool, but our primary responsibility is Social Security. And for the millennials especially, it's not just the wage differential or wage stagnation, but it's also enormous student loan debt, the gig economy and everything that has, the lack of high-paying labor jobs, the fact that there'll be a generation that will probably earn less than their parents earned and are going to rely more on Social Security. And primarily, again, because of the opioid epidemic, et cetera, actually, the death rate tables have dropped and have come down. And so, but even as people are living longer, all the more reason that actuarially, where we are responsible, that we make the program solvent and that it's able to accomplish its goals. But Tom, Mark Meadows, I mean, you would think that it would be strange bedfellows, Mark Meadows and myself, but he talks about his mom and everything that she needed in order to make this program secure. Tom Price, who lost their dads and were raised on Social Security. Rich Neal, the chairman of the committee, lost his mother and father. And so I think everybody understands the importance and significance. The issue is, can we look in the mirror and say, hey, listen, if we raise the age and that's a 7% cut to somebody, how do they handle it? This is the reality of what they'll receive. That's would be my point.
All right, once again, thank you, Chairman Larson. You can take your Starbucks cup and appreciate your
Thank you, Mr.
testimony
Chairman.
once again, absolutely. I'd now like to ask our second panel to take their seats. Right, as I mentioned to Chairman Larson, your written statements will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. First introduce Dr. Favreau. Begin when you are ready.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee. My name is Melissa Favreau, and I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. The views I express today are my own and not those of the Urban Institute, its board, or its funders. Last month, the Social Security and Medicare trustees released their annual reports, repeating their warning that these programs have significant shortfalls. These need to be closed by either increased program revenues, reductions in the rate of growth of benefits, or some combination. They emphasize that earlier action will make it easier to spread the costs of change across more generations and to avoid sudden changes that could harm beneficiaries and workers. Given these programs' broad reach into our economy and society, we need sustained discussions about how to meet these challenges. My contribution to today's discussion emphasizes 5 points. First, our current social insurance programs work well, providing powerful protection against risk for seniors and people with disabilities. They form the foundation of our social contract with working and middle-class Americans. Social Security benefit progressivity reduces labor market risk. Annuitization reduces the risk of long life and outliving one's assets. Inflation protection reduces financial risk. Disability and survivors benefits reduce health and early mortality risk. The program has been enormously successful. Meyer and Wu recently estimated that Social Security reduces the overall poverty rate by about 1/3 and age and poverty by 3/4, and 2/3 of benefits go to people who were poor prior to transfers. In seeking solutions to Social Security's long-run financing imbalance, we must bear in mind that economic inequality has eroded the program's wage base. Since the mid-1970s, typical workers' wages have not kept up with productivity, but wages at the very top have grown rapidly. Critically for Social Security, the share of total earnings the program taxes has fallen from 90% to close to 83%. Inequality thus contributes to Social Security's fiscal imbalance. Increasing the wage base should be part of the solution. Large disparities in longevity pose challenges with equitable distribution of Social Security and Medicare benefits. By more than one estimates, workers in the highest income quartile of the earnings distribution in their early 50s can expect to live more than 10 years longer than those in the lowest. Social Security's broad support stems from public perception that benefits are an earned right with benefits linked to contribution. So long-range solutions must retain this society-wide investment by maintaining broad-based financing and strong income-related benefits. Second, these core social insurance programs have a few gaps. Too many seniors, and especially long-term caregivers, women, especially if they're unmarried, African Americans, Latinos, less educated workers, and people with health problems and disabilities, and the oldest old have incomes that hover below or near poverty. Many are vulnerable to very large healthcare bills. In part to help account for the importance of healthcare costs, Census Bureau researchers compute supplemental poverty. According to this measure, roughly 14% of adults aged 65 or older, or approximately 7 million people, are estimated to be poor. Some promising ideas for closing Social Security adequacy gaps include minimum benefits and caregiver credits. A full career of work at the minimum wage does not guarantee a poverty-level benefit from Social Security, and long caregiving spells are associated with higher risk of low benefits. So there's a strong case for bolstering benefits. To the extent to which we're concerned with health care affordability and health shocks, adjustments to Medicare cost sharing or Medicaid eligibility could help as well. Third, the risk of needing long-term services and supports, estimated to be as high as 70% at ages 65 plus in recent years, poses enormous challenges for retirees. A year of paid home care can cost $40,000. A year in a nursing home can be more than double that. Because these costs are unaffordable for so many, we rely heavily on unpaid family caregivers. Many jeopardize their own retirement security to help their family members. Fourth, since Social Security's inception, it's been acknowledged that responsibility for retirement security does not fall solely on this program. Employers play a crucial role through offering retirement accounts. Behavioral economics can teach us how to better structure employer retirement accounts to boost participation and contributions. However, access issues remain. Nearly 30% of workers have no access on the job, and about 45% are not participating. In the lowest wage quartile, more than half don't have access and 3/4 are not participating. Current federal subsidies for retirement savings and defined contribution plans overwhelmingly reach those in the top fifth of the income distribution. A better approach would be to promote saving among those who most need to save and for whom saving is most difficult. Tax credits, for example, would work better than deductions at reaching lower savers and vulnerable workers. Finally, as we seek solutions to our fiscal challenges, we need to recognize that inequality and social and economic disparities today are deep. They often extend across multiple domains and in some cases may be growing. The same people who do not have good jobs and thus access to retirement accounts are the same people who are more likely to become disabled. When we look at disparities in severe disability and dementia, for example, by education and race, the differences across groups are stunning. These disparities constrain our financing options. Revenue increases need to provide a very large share of the solution. Over the long run, investments in education and younger workers must also be part of the solution. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. I look forward to questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Mrs. Cooke, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Yarmouth, Congressman Womack, and committee members. I'm Anne Marie Cooke, President and CEO of Lifespan of Greater Rochester, a nonprofit in New York State solely focused on providing information, guidance, and services to older adults. In 2018, we served 38,000 older adults and family caregivers. Financial management is one of our core services. My remarks today will address the state of current and future Social Security beneficiaries. According to the National Institute on Retirement Security, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, 3/4 of Americans say the nation faces a retirement crisis. 70% say the average worker cannot save enough to guarantee a secure retirement. And 79% say they don't know enough about investing to ensure savings last through retirement. There may be economists who tell you that America does not face a retirement crisis. We and many others disagree with that assessment because I see people in crisis every day. As president of Lifespan, I can tell you that the 1/4 of current beneficiaries who are relying on Social Security for 90% of their income are not, in fact, living comfortably. Neither are the 43% of non-married beneficiaries who rely on Social Security for 90% of their income. And neither are the 33% of African Americans who receive at least 90% of their income from Social Security. According to the Government Accountability Office, Social Security provides most of the income for about half of the households 65 and older. And despite Social Security, 4.6 million Americans 65 and older, almost 10%, lived below the poverty line in 2016. That's just $11,800 a year. And using a newer supplemental poverty measure, 15% of older Americans are living below the poverty level. These are older Americans who worked low-income jobs without pension benefits. These are older Americans who lived paycheck to paycheck, who couldn't save. These are older Americans who did not plan to live to 80, 90, or even older. Lifespan routinely assists older adults who are living on Social Security alone. Many are women without a substantial work history who rely on survivor benefits. Currently, we're helping Mary, an 84-year-old widow who just has $1,400 a month on Social Security and can't pay all her bills. When her husband died in 2018, she lost his pension. We also know about Sam and Angelica. We're working with them, both in their early 80s. Sam's former employer folded, taking his pension with it. They counted on the three-legged stool, but with Angelica's illness, most of their savings are now gone. I received a call from their daughter from Columbus, Ohio. She told me the father said, "I hope we just die. This is too stressful." Lifespan is also home to the upstate New York Elder Abuse Center. Older adults who are financially abused all too often lose everything but Social Security. We're helping Jim. Jim is a 62-year-old contract employee who suffered a brain injury. While recovering, his son drained his accounts. His only remaining income is Social Security. And I wish this was an isolated story, but in New York State alone, 260,000 older adults will be a victim of elder abuse or financial exploitation this year. The outlook for future retirees is wobbly at best. The three-legged stool of retirement, pensions, personal savings, and Social Security is for many history. Only 38% of baby boomers expect to have a pension. A 2016 GOA report says 48% of Americans are approaching retirement who have nothing saved in a 401k or other retirement accounts. Profound changes in retirement funding have occurred over the last 2 decades, yet our knowledge of financial literacy is woeful. As one retiree recently told me, when you had a pension, they took care of it. Now they tell you you have to take care of it. Then the stock market goes up and down. It's very hard to understand, and it's very hard to be sure of anything. And finally, of course, I must address the age wave. Today, about 52 million Americans are 65 or older. In 10 years, 72 million. And by 2040, 82 million Americans will be 65 or older. As president of an organization assisting older adults, I can emphatically tell you that Social Security is critical. To survive as the bedrock of retirement security for older Americans, change must occur, but this change cannot include a benefits cut. The retirement crisis is real, both at the federal and at a very personal level for older Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Hanner for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yermuth, Ranking Member Walmack, members of the committee, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at today's hearing on retirement security on the 21st century. Hello, I'm Dale Hanner, retiree and Secretary-Treasurer of the North Carolina Committee to Protect Pensions. I'm retired with 36 years of service with 4 different companies in the Central States Pension Plan. A multi-employer pension plan which is facing insolvency within 6 years. This multi-employer plan has allowed me to build and retain years of service that would have been lost in a single employer plan. The purpose of the North Carolina Committee is to educate and advocate for the more than 12,000 Central States members retired and active in our state. The NCCPP is a member of the National United Committee to Protect Pensions. I would like to tell you about a few of our survivor members and their situation. In their generation, Central States offered a survivor benefit package requiring retirees to forfeit 15% of their pension in order to leave 50% of their pension to their surviving spouse. One member's husband's pension was $1,375 per month. After his death, her survivor benefit is now $750 a month. She has had to forego 2 medicines because of high cost. She pays her hospital bills and those of her late husband in monthly payments. Another member's husband's pension was $700 per month. After his death, her pension is $385 a month. She is diabetic and pays $600 for a 90-day supply of insulin. This is an out-of-pocket expense for her. One 78 years young surviving member draws $318 of her husband's $630 pension. She works at least 3 days a week to supplement her income. As you can see, these are not large, hefty pensions that are being collected. In fact, the average monthly pension payment to a Central States retiree is $1,200, so any potential cut in the retiree benefits would be devastating. In addition to food, property tax, and housing maintenances, the North Carolina Public Utilities and the property insurance companies intend to petition the state for rate increases this year due to damage to the state of North Carolina from 2 hurricanes. Gas has increased 25 cents in the last 2 months, and the cost of living keeps going up. Once we retire, there is no cost of living in our pensions. Stories have circulated on Capitol Hill that one of the conditions for a pension fix is the retirees must have some skin in the game. Truthfully, some retirees are being skinned alive. Approximately 1,200 Central States retirees die each year. A close working colleague of mine has just finished his first week of hospice. He's a Vietnam veteran, has 28 years of service in Central States. The average age of a Central States retiree is 72 years old with a life expectancy of 81, according to Central States. My friend is 70 years old, same age of his wife. In 2018, he spent 200 days in and out of a hospital and rehabilitation center after contracting a blood infection he picked up in the hospital resulting from a procedure to remove a nerve stimulator in his back. Can you imagine dying not knowing if the financial security you planned would be provided for your surviving spouse? Representatives Neal and King's bill, H.R. 397, is the best and the only real solution to help retirees and protect their hard-earned pensions. It will avoid retiree benefit cuts and provide improved retirement security for retirees and workers. The loans will not only enable plans to secure the pensions promised to retirees and their families, but also direct remaining assets and all future contributions to fully protect benefits for active workers. H.R. 397's legislation would create non-taxpayer loans. Our pension fund has decreased from $16 billion to $13 billion within 2.5 years, and Central States is only 27% funded. Very soon, Central States will not have enough money to qualify for a loan. Our fund will go insolvent, and we will be turned over to the PPGC. After paying to insure our pensions since 1974, we've been told that the PBGC payout will only be pennies on the dollar because the PBGC is broke. Please let us work together to find a solution. Time is running out for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanner. Now recognize Dr. Biggs for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak on retirement security in the 21st century. Retirement savings is an exceedingly important topic for households, for policymakers, and for the U.S. economy. Unfortunately, there's a great deal of ignorance with regard to the adequacy of Americans' retirement savings, and I mean ignorance literally. There are a great many facts in U.S. retirement savings and retirement incomes of which many elected officials are simply unaware, in part because the news media prefer to run stories on a supposedly looming retirement crisis than articles acknowledging that, in fact, things are going fairly well. For instance, Few readers of a national newspaper would know that more Americans are saving for retirement today than ever before, or that retirement plan contributions are up by nearly 1/3 compared to the era of traditional pensions, or that retirees' incomes are rising significantly faster than incomes for working-age households. Most retirees today have incomes well above the 70% replacement rate that financial advisors say is enough to allow a retiree to maintain their pre-retirement standard of living. This doesn't mean Americans aren't worried, and yet these fears are rarely realized. Vanguard recently polled retirees whether they thought the nation as a whole faced a, quote, retirement crisis. A majority of them said yes. When asked if they would describe their own financial situation in those terms, only 4% did. This isn't being Pollyanna-ish. Compared to other developed countries, Americans have substantially higher retirement savings, and U.S. retirees are much more likely to say they're able to maintain their pre-retirement standard of living. There are also things policymakers may believe that aren't facts at all. For instance, we hear that more Americans will retire into poverty in coming years. In fact, recent Census Bureau research has shown that the share of retirees living in poverty has dropped by nearly 1/3 over the past 2 decades, and the Social Security Administration projects that poverty will continue to fall through at least the 2030s. We also hear that Americans have no retirement savings. In fact, total retirement plan assets are 6 times higher today than when traditional defined benefit pensions roamed the earth. And recent Federal Reserve research has shown that the shift from traditional pensions to 401ks has not caused greater inequality in retirement savings. I point these things out because unless we come to a common base of understanding with what's happening with retirement savings, we can't form policies to build on the successes of the U.S. retirement system. And that's what we need to do, build on our successes. 401ks are already more widespread than traditional pensions ever were. And because both employers and employees contribute, total retirement savings are higher. 401ks have introduced automatic enrollment to increase employee participation, target date funds to automatically rebalance portfolios, and low-cost index funds to reduce fees. As a result, no longer do traditional pensions have either a management cost or a rate of return advantage over 401ks. But we need to spread these successes. I favor making automatic enrollment universal, at least for employees earning above the poverty line. I also favor legislation like the Secure Act, which would make it easier for smaller employers to offer retirement plans. The retirement plan coverage gap is smaller than many believe. Nevertheless, smaller employers still remain much less likely to offer 401ks, which are the most effective way to save for retirement. We also need to address the risk of high health costs in retirement. Note that I focus on risk. Out-of-pocket health costs have barely risen as a percentage of retirees' incomes over the past 3 decades, mostly because retiree incomes are rising so rapidly. But health costs can vary significantly from person to person. While government bears most of that risk through Medicare and Medicaid, I would favor having retirees bear a larger share of everyday costs in return for greater protection against the worst health cost outcomes. Finally, government at all levels need to get their retirement funding in order. The best research on retirement savings, the studies that are published in peer-reviewed journals rather than on activist groups' websites, show only a modest retirement savings shortfall. But underfunding in Social Security, federal employee and military pensions, and state and local government pensions is estimated at between $14 and $26 trillion. This is by far the biggest threat to retirement security and should be addressed as promptly as possible, as fully as possible, recognizing the tough choices that are involved and avoiding gimmicks. Thank you very much.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Now we will start our questioning period. And first, ranking member and I will defer our questions to the end. So I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Jakowski, for 5 minutes.
Well, we could have a war of statistics. I don't really want to get into it, although there are some data. I know that more than half of Americans can't withstand easily, without some sort of financial crisis, even a $500 hit on their income. And I've got some data here from, is it Motley Fool, that says that the amount of their investment analysts, the average amount of money that older Americans have when they retire is something like, was it $7,000? You know, you can shake your head and, you know, you're smart and you've got a lot of statistics. But the real world that I deal with, too, and my constituents, is a very different world than is projected here. Even averages, I think, are really skewing toward the wealthiest Americans. because we have such vast income inequality that if you start averaging out, I want to say that I volunteer at a food bank, and at the end of the month, who do you see lining up? It's the seniors, because they have run out of their Social Security. And I think most Americans are wondering, can I retire? And in fact, the woman that was bagging my groceries not long ago, I'm telling you, I definitely went to help her bag my groceries. She was clearly working beyond the age that she should be working, but not beyond the age that she needed to be working. I am the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Task Force on Aging and Families, used to be called the Seniors Task Force. We've had report after report from organizations, including the AARP and the retirement security groups, that talk about the challenges that older Americans face. And so I'm glad that we have a piece of legislation that would deal with the issue right now and not try to hide it, I think, in some numbers that don't reflect what ordinary Americans, and in terms of women, by the way, you know, they carry this income, this wage inequality with them into retirement. So many of the people, probably, I'm sure most of the people that are living in near poverty and relying just on their Social Security are women. I also wanted to say to the ranking member that, you know, everyone is living longer is not true. There's a big disparity there, too. We've even seen an increase in white working class men whose longevity has taken a bit of a dive. African Americans, especially African American men, aren't necessarily living longer or living to see, and that's why raising the age of Social Security would be a significant problem. So, you know, our task force is going to be addressing this issue and hopefully coming up in a bipartisan way with a solution. I wanted to ask you, Mrs. Cooke, what are the most common financial problems that you're seeing in Rochester seniors? What are the expenses that are most crippling to some of the people you serve?
Very clearly, it's healthcare costs, prescription drugs, out-of-pocket costs for co-payments, and as a result of that they can't pay the rest of their bills. They're making decisions on whether or not to pay their healthcare costs or buy food or pay for their utilities, and it's a terrible decision that older adults have to make. And in fact, we're seeing that really about a third of our clients our clients, about a third of their income is going to those healthcare costs that are rising, that we're seeing are rising.
And hopefully, we're going to be dealing with the cost of prescription drugs also in this session of Congress. Again, Mrs. Cooke, do the seniors lifespan that you work with generally have savings that they're able to rely on? What's been your experience in the amount of money that they have been able to put away?
They have tried to save. I'm going to go back to my story about Sam and Angelica because I recently met with this couple. They put 3 kids through college. They saved $30,000, which was difficult for them going into retirement. But Angelica has dementia, and she requires home health care aides, and they have gone through that money. Their small pension and Social Security isn't making it anymore, and they honestly do feel that death is their only option. And so that's what folks are dealing with today, that kind of anxiety, that kind of pressure, and all based because they just don't have enough money to survive.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Stewart of Utah for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member and members of the sitting at the witness table. And, you know, I'm honored to serve on this committee. I actually ask and press for this. I sit on 2 other committees, Intelligence and Appropriations. They're very busy. But I wanted to sit on this committee because I am interested in these topics. It's the reason I ran for Congress 6 or 7 years ago, because I thought we're committing national suicide with some of our spending and our debt and some of the fiscal policies and decisions that we were making. It's the reason that again, why I ran and why I'm here. And my background lends me to sympathy on these. My father was an Air Force pilot, a farmer, and a school teacher. My mother raised 10 kids, if you can imagine. And they were not wealthy. They were a family of modest means, but they paid into Social Security, and they expected that that would be there for them in their retirement. And I think everyone in this room wants, and we want to facilitate that same expectation, to save this program for those people who most need it and relying on it. We want to protect Social Security, but I read something recently, and this is well quoted, I'm sure you all are aware of it, where young people were asked if what they believed was more likely, UFOs or that they would have Social Security when they retired, and more of them believed in UFOs than that they would have Social Security. And you know what? They're right. That's not a bad bet, because there might actually be UFOs. I don't think there are, but it's a possibility. But if we don't fix this, then it's a mathematical reality that they won't have the other. And so as absurd as it sounds, it's not foolish for them to take what might be at least possible and taking that over something that is mathematically impossible if we don't fix it. And that's why these hearings are very important. The good news is, and there is good news, and that is we can fix this. It's not impossible. There's still time to fix it. And we can do it without impacting retirees now, without those who are relying on it now, which is something that I think all of us are committing to do it. But it needs to be done on a bipartisan basis. And one last thought on this. We've been told this is the third rail. As a politician, you're foolish to touch it. I think that's nuts. That has not been my experience at all. When I talk about this with my constituents and others, they are begging us to fix it. They're not stupid. The American people aren't stupid. And you tell them this is what it's going to take to fix it. In a bipartisan manner, people like me are going to have to consider that we have to look at the tax side of it. I'm willing to concede that and accept that. And it's hard for me to do. I didn't come to Congress to raise taxes, but I recognize that's part of the equation. I think we also have to consider raising the retirement age, looking at COLA adjustments, looking at means testing. But if someone is not willing to consider all of those options, then they're not serious about fixing this. And they're frankly part of the problem then. And it's going to take all of those to do that. So, Dr. Biggs, I could ask you, this is yes, no question, and then I want to get to something that really matters. Do you believe that the best and first option and only option is raising taxes, or is it going to take more than that?
No, it will take both sides.
Clearly, it's going to take more than that. And I want to emphasize something, and this will sound dramatic, but I want you to give meat on this bones. What does it mean if by the projections are by the 2030s or so, that we actually bankrupt this system, that we're not able to make the payments? What does that mean to someone? Help people understand, because I think people generally think, well, that's going to affect someone else or it won't affect me. What will that mean to someone who's relying on Social Security at that point?
Well, the kids who think it's more likely they'll see a UFO are not correct. They will see Social Security. If we do see UFOs, I hope they bring money with them that we can use. But Social Security, as long as it's collecting payroll taxes, can continue to pay benefits. It will not become bankrupt in the sense of paying nothing. But once the trust fund runs out in 2035, Social Security has no legal authority to pay the full promise benefits. It can only pay with the money it has on hand. That implies a 20% plus reduction in benefits, not just for new retirees, but for all retirees, not just for retirees themselves, but for disabled, for survivors. So this is sort of the worst case outcome that you're trying to avoid. You know, we can fix this. But to leave it to the last minute means the choices get bigger and get more difficult. And so it's always better to do it sooner than later.
Well, and in 15 seconds I have, would that required 20%, would that be across the board, or would there be, the government have discretion on who those cuts would be applied to?
It would probably not have discretion. You'd need, to do that, you'd need new legislation.
So those on the very lowest, as well as those on the higher income, they would also be impacted with a 20% reduction?
When I was at the Social Security Administration, that was our interpretation of the law.
All right, thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, first of all, for hosting this hearing, which is critically important, as I think all of our witnesses have testified to. A promise made, in my view, should always be a promise kept. However, for too many Americans, the promise and assurance that Social Security represents is quickly fading away, as we've learned this morning. After a lifetime of hard work and paying into the system, every person deserves to enter their later years in life with the peace of mind and the knowledge that Social Security will be there for them. Yet fewer dollars are going into Social Security than are being paid out, and the program is in danger of being insolvent, as we've heard mentioned several times this morning. In my view, this is simply unacceptable. It is critical we strengthen resources available to older community members, protect essential programs like Social Security, and address the multi-employer pension crisis, which has been talked about this morning, so that current and future generations can depend on the benefits they've received. I'm encouraged by our friend and colleague, Representative Larson, who's taking meaningful steps to safeguard access to Social Security and ensure the long-term viability of the essential program for years to come through the Social Security 2100 Act, which I am proud to co-sponsor and support and hope comes before the House soon for consideration. I did want to go to one of the, what I think I heard, my understanding of Representative Larson and those who have looked at it actuarially, that a modest increase in the Social Security tax for those individuals earning $400,000 or more would actually make it not only solvent but sustainable, and that does not involve benefit cuts. Mr. Biggs, have you seen that that analysis, and do you disagree with the actuaries who've looked at that?
I've read the actuarial memo on the Social Security 2100 Act. What it would do would be phase out the taxable maximum wage for Social Security, beginning at $400,000, but eventually all wages would be subject to tax. That implies a 12.4% effective marginal tax increase on high earners, which means that your top tax rate goes up by 12.4 percentage points. So then we're in Scandinavian territory. So it becomes a question of modesty on that. The more recently, the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School used an economic model to simulate the Social Security 2100 Act, and when they found when you took into account the changes in benefits, the benefit increases, and the changes in taxes, it would shrink GDP by 2050 by about 7 percentage points relative to a solvency plan that relied on benefit cuts. That's about $2.6 trillion in these terms. So the economic effects of raising those taxes and increasing benefits are pretty significant.
And the benefit
and the actuaries don't account for any of that.
And the benefits you're talking about are the benefits that would accrue to people earning more than $400,000 who would be paying an additional amount in? Those are the increased benefits, or are you talking about
No,
the
because the
CPI?
Social Security 2100 Act increases benefits across the board relative to promised levels.
I want to go back to something, Ms. Cooke, that you talked about in your testimony, which is dealt with financial literacy. And do you have a sense, I asked us two things. One is, first of all, the relative awareness that people have, financial literacy for people who are in the retirement years, and then also for younger people, and I don't know how much your organization talks to organizations that represent schools and universities and others that would hopefully be in a position to start talking about financial literacy to younger people, because obviously the sooner you start. Can you just tell me your sense of financial literacy among the retirees that you have, how prepared they were for what they now face?
Congressman, what we see is they're not prepared at all, and that they struggle when they have to make decisions about investing their own 401ks or other accounts. They just have not had that kind of training. We're trying to figure that out and help them along the way to give them that kind of information. In terms of younger people, I don't know, but I think right now we are woefully lacking education and financial literacy so people can prepare for retirement.
Well, it seems to me strengthening Social Security is obviously an imperative here, but to the point that you just made, I would argue, and I say this to my children all the time, I know you're in your late 20s, early 30s, you should start thinking about this, because it will come much sooner than you think it will. Because I feel like I'm 30 still, and it's come much faster than I would have expected. But I think this is really important, particularly with people entering the workforce, to give serious thought to what they're going to do in the out years. So strengthening Social Security and making sure they have financial literacy seems to me are critical objectives that we ought to achieve. So thank you all for your testimony.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much for being here with us. Dr. Biggs, I would like to first ask you, please, what do you think of the Social Security 2100 Act in broad terms or specific terms?
Well, If you go back, I mean, I think it's worth, Congressman Larson talked about the 1983 reforms where President Reagan and the Democratic House and Republican Senate came together to produce a package to fix Social Security. That was roughly 50% tax increases, 50% benefit cuts. I mean, you know, you can qualify things that you want, but it was roughly half and half. The Social Security 2100 Act, and I agree you need to have bipartisan cooperation on this. That's how it's going to happen. The Social Security 2100 Act is more than 100% tax increases because it raises taxes to fully pay for promised benefits, and then it raises taxes by a greater amount in order to increase benefits, to expand Social Security. Realistically, that's not going to happen. So people need to come together and as you were talking about, Congressman Stewart, say what things you're willing to give on. If your starting point is more than 100% tax increases, I think that's going to be a difficult bipartisan lift.
Okay, when you mentioned Scandinavian levels, so basically we're talking about 37.5 plus 12.4. That's
Plus Medicare taxes. In some states, state income tax rates are as high as 10. California's 13%. That it gets to the point where if you think you're ever going to afford Medicare for all or something like that by taxing the rich, you will never do it because your top tax rates, you'll be tapped out on the rate.
over 50%.
Well over 50%.
Scandinavian
Well over 50%.
levels. So my next question then, what recommendations can you make that would improve the long-term solvency of Social Security?
Well, there's a lot of research that shows that middle and high-income folks, the folks who have 401ks, who are financially literate, they trade their personal savings off against Social Security. If you raise their Social Security benefits, they will, in fact, save less. If you lower their Social Security benefits, at least on a long-term basis, they will save more and they will work longer. So for those folks, it is acceptable to slow the growth of benefits because they will make it up on their own. The same research tends to show that lower income folks aren't as responsive to those incentives. For those folks, I favor not just maintaining promised Social Security benefits, but expanding them, making the safety net stronger. That's a way we can make the program work for the people who need it the most while letting people who can afford to save more and work longer do so. That's the most sustainable route to fixing Social Security, but also leaving a little room in the budget for all the other things the government does.
Okay. The taxable maximum on Social Security increases, and that's the question, every year?
Along with the rate of wage growth. So if wages grow faster, the taxable maximum grows as
So
well.
how much each year?
It's right now is 132.7, so roughly 4% per year.
4% per
That's
year?
the projected nominal rate of wage growth.
Okay, so over a 10-year period, clearly, we're going to be 40% higher, which is in the neighborhood of $165,000 or so.
Sure.
Where we are today. Okay, so it's increasing every year. So all of those at that level, more or less, are going to be at a 42 to 43% tax range already with, when you add the income tax plus the FICA, the 16.2.
Exactly. So for those folks, eliminating the taxable maximum or phasing it out as Social Security 2100 do, those people are not millionaires and billionaires. They're somebody making $150,000, which is a good standard of living,
Right.
but it is not necessarily who you think you're hitting.
And with state tax, it's near 50%, so their take-home income is in the neighborhood of $90,000. They're paying nearly $70,000 a year in federal and state taxes. What about the age question? What are your thoughts on that?
It is true that Americans are on average living longer, but there is a wide disparity. The richest Americans, as a guess, would live about 8 or 9 years longer past retirement than the poorest ones. The poorest ones are much more dependent on Social Security. I'm not against raising the retirement age as a signal to people to work longer. They will, the research shows they will accept that signal and they will work longer, but I would also make other changes within Social Security to protect the people who are on the bottom, who are the poorest people, who don't live as long, to make them whole. So raising the retirement age isn't the only thing you do. There's other parts of the package, and we can fix it so it will not hurt the people on the bottom.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Biggs, you mentioned the fact that when Social Security so-called goes broke, they can still make payments. Do you know what percentage payments they can make?
I think around 80%.
And the inflation adjustment as we go forward is the wage growth. Do you know what that 80% would be compared to just regular inflation?
The wage growth adjustment is made to the taxable maximum. I'm not sure I'm 100% understanding the question.
The benefits go up too.
Yes, oh, that's correct. Yes, benefits, scheduled benefits under Social Security rise roughly with wages each year, so about a percentage point faster than inflation. So some people say even after that 20% cut, they'd be higher than today. I'm not 100% sure, but.
Okay, but you indicated the sooner the better. Why is it better to fix it sooner than later?
Well, it gives people more time to respond. If you think about the current increase in the retirement age, it was passed in 1983. It didn't even begin phasing in until 2000. It's not fully implemented until age 67, till I think 2022. You don't hear anybody, yelling and screaming about the retirement age today because they have had so much warning. If we leave it till 2035, then we have to pull the rug out from underneath people, and that's very, very hard.
Thank you. Mr. Hammer, you talked about the multi-employer pensions and the problems with the failure of the multi-employer pensions. What would happen, what effects to the federal budget would occur if these pensions failed?
To the federal government, you would have the revenue off of, I think it's 1.5 million workers. They lose that revenue right off the bat.
And the taxes they would be paying?
The taxes they would also lose.
And the increased utilization of food stamps and Medicaid?
They would have to turn somewhere. To eliminate your pensions, I think you change from a retirement, maybe a comfortable retirement, to a survival mode. And there's a big difference between comfortable retirement and a survival mode.
Well,
like the congressman said, you run out of food at the end of the month.
What are your proposals to fix it?
The Neal bill,
Which, Lewis?
HR 397 seems to be the best approach to it whatsoever. It seems to be the cheapest approach to it whatsoever.
Thank you. Ms. Cooke, there are a lot of students with significant student loans. What effect does a student loan have on your ability to save for retirement?
Well, it makes it almost impossible. And, I was talking to someone the other day, they had student loans until they started helping their children go to college. So, you take all of those earning years in which they're paying back their own student loans and then trying to help their children, it makes savings very difficult.
And the fact that you have to start 10 or 20 years later saving up for your retirement because you had to pay the student loans, what does that have on the ultimate size of the nest egg?
Well, it makes it almost impossible to have that third leg of stool of savings in anything significant. And what we have seen is even when people have saved, once they have a health issue of any kind, that savings they go through very quickly.
Do you know the effect of immigration reform, what that would have on Social Security?
Sir, I don't know.
Ms. Farnow, would you know?
Yes, we can think of immigration as akin to adding births to the population in the sense that, except they're a little bit older, so you're going to have more workers per beneficiary, and that's an excellent thing for Social Security's health. The Social Security Trustees Report has some information in the appendix about immigrants adding, say, roughly 300 or 330,000 on average. That could have an effect of reduce about 9% of the shortfall. So definitely a strong labor force is an integral part of
Essentially, because they'd be coming in paying and nobody coming in would be receiving. Can you say a word about the effect of the gig economy on people's ability to save?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Obviously, there are a great diversity in gig workers. We see that those who are gig only often have very, very little retirement savings. Very few are participating. Those who are both gig and also have an additional full-time job are a little bit more likely to be prepared, but those who are gig only, again, extremely vulnerable.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Womack, and thanks to all of you today for being here to testify on this. You know, as a taxpayer and a person who believes that our country's greatest threat is our 3D problem, our deficit, our debt, and our demographics issue. And, you know, I appreciate we're having this conversation about mandatory spending. I say it's not an entitlement. We've talked about that. You know, a lot of people get that wrong. I think it's us taking the good faith and credit of the United States and believing in that promise. And, you know, according to the Board of Trustees for Social Security and Medicare, if Congress does nothing, both will be insolvent within the next 25 years. Insolvency, as we've been describing, is, you know, we can just debate that all day long. And this is a grim reality for the working class Americans who have spent their entire lives paying into these systems with the promise that money will be there when they need it. I gotta confess, I grew up extraordinarily poor, food stamps, no running water. I've heard my entire life that Social Security would never be there for me. I've never counted on it. I think most Americans, truthfully, when they're younger and they're working, they don't count on it. They work as if it's not going to be there, and some money shows up at the end of their lives, and they're appreciative for that. My questions today, I've got a multitude of questions, but I just it's sort of a fact-finding mission. And Dr. Biggs, I appreciate your outlining here the 13 things you didn't know about, or probably wish you knew, or whatever. But let me just ask some questions, and maybe just simple yeses or nos, or if you want to expound on them, that'd be great. But wage growth helps close the gap on Social Security deficits, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Lower unemployment helps close that gap.
Yes, it does.
And we have the lowest unemployment in recorded history, in this, at least in the history that I've read about.
Since the late 1960s, yeah.
Legal immigration to replace a scarce resource, available workforce, would be very beneficial, legal workforce, to close this gap.
Yes.
We have 7.6 million jobs unfilled. If we had those filled, we'd also help replace this need. And we could talk about why we also need legal immigration. We have a workforce that's been depleted, if you will. And let's talk about some facts on that. We can talk about our pro-choice conversations that we've had, hundreds of thousands of abortions. We could also talk about our low birth rate, just described today in the Wall Street Journal as the lowest in 40-something years and not getting any better. We also could talk about, again, our aging population, as we described, as the chairman described in his opening comments. Could you also help me understand, because I've heard a lot of numbers, what's been the average rate or ROI or return on the investment of Social Security invested dollars in the United States?
There's two ways of thinking about it. One is the rate of return on the Social Security Trust Fund, and that's invested in special issue government bonds, right now 5%, I would think. Then there's the rate of return that the individual gets from the program. They pay money in and they get money out.
But that's really all that matters to the
individual. And you can calculate an interest rate from that. That started out extraordinarily high. The early generations of Social Security couldn't have done better in Vegas. They made a lot of money on it because the benefits were relatively generous. They had a short career of paying low taxes. But that's a seesaw. And they gained a lot of money. Future generations, Social Security, one way or the other, no matter how you fix it, will be a money loser for future generations, simply because the early generations got such a good deal. So the argument, tax or cut benefits is
so there might be a viable argument in there, as we've heard about since the 90s, certainly about some self-directed ability, if you had the ability to self-direct some of that. That's for open debate. We could spend a day talking about that. Does a growing economy and robust markets help close the funding gap?
It will, but it will not close it by itself.
Would it also, and I'm sorry, I can't see your name there, sir, next to you there, but we're talking about pensions. Would that also, a growing marketplace, robust economy, does that help close the pension gap?
It seemed to be there'd be more people hired.
So, well, in the investment of your funds into certain investments that gets a better return, if there's a return as opposed to a loss, if you're from the investment side of those dollars you've taken.
If we were able to invest in the market. Since we've gotten so low, dipped so low, our money has been put into guaranteed interest. We can't afford a drop in the market. Perfect
Conversation. Our national debt and our annual deficit are keeping those interest rates really low. The day of getting 5% returns are gone, because we know for every 1% we add, that's $200 billion in additional deficit every year. And so we know that that's a problem. So our deficits and our debts are having problems across the board, and having the fallacies of promising something with pensions, defined benefit programs, or our Social Security is going to be problematic if we can't figure out how to get a control on our deficits and debts. And I would just like to say one thing, and I know I'm over, Mr. Chairman, but in reference to the student loans, I think it's safe to say that anybody in here that had a student loan would raise their hand would also not like to have ever paid it back or pay it back. So, but that's an obligation that you promised and signed upon to take to go get a 4-year education. And I think we've got to be really careful about forgiving student loans because that is an investment in your future, and so you should invest wisely. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was a little frustrated by the discussion we had. I felt like people were talking past each other. It's pretty obvious that from Dr. Biggs, a lot of people are doing fine. The economy's good for a lot of people. People have saved. That's terrific. That didn't really address the distributional effect of people who aren't doing well, who really need Social Security to keep them out of poverty. And I think what really occurred to me is that, you know, we call it an insurance plan, but really Social Security is more like a retirement plan because we pay it out to people even if they don't need it. Insurance, you call on, you pay a premium every year. You call on it when you need it. And we don't, that's really not what Social Security is because people who don't need it, like Mr. Biggs or Dr. Biggs described, are still getting the payment and they could adjust for that. And to me, that strikes me as an opportunity for some discussion. We talked a lot about a lot of other issues that we put on Social Security that we should be dealing with separately. The cost of health care is a separate issue. If the cost of health care was cheaper, that would certainly be good for the people that I think you're concerned about. We talked a little bit about tax policy and deficits. I mean, I got to tell you that I think that one of the saddest things we did was the tax cuts we did last year for people who didn't need them, didn't need tax cuts. We overshot the corporate tax cut by a good 4 or 5% from even what Mitt Romney and the Business Roundtable had been asking for. And then we talk about deficits here. I oppose that. I think that was unwise policy. And I do think that student loans is still a burden on folks. I think they should be, I don't believe in free college, but I also don't believe in gouging people with 6 or 8% loans when the cost of money to the federal government is something around 3%. So we talked a lot, at least obliquely, about a lot of issues here. But one thing I wanted to raise was that I think we ought to have a more direct approach to retirement. We have a minimum wage in this country. It's actually, when I was working for the minimum wage, it was, I think, $2.65 an hour. I don't think anyone suggests the minimum wage should not have risen. Even Dr. Biggs probably thinks there's some role for raising that. Now it's at $7.25. I think we're due for another increase. One part of that increase might be suggested by the Saving for the Future Act, which I've introduced in the House with Representatives McBath and Blunt-Rochester. It's been introduced in the Senate by Senator Coons and Klobuchar, which would, since we have a minimum wage, we don't have a minimum contribution to retirement, and this would make a 50-cent minimum retirement contribution. So that when, over the course of your career, if you work the whole time and just with that minimum, would generate over $600,000 worth of savings for people. That could be combined with a minimum wage increase, so that if you didn't want to go all the way up to $15, you could say, well, $14.50 plus 50 cents for retirement. That would be a good compromise, or some other area. I mean, I think there's a lot of approaches to addressing the minimum wage, but a minimum retirement contribution would make a lot of sense and would take a lot of the pressure off of Social Security. Because employers would be paying into it over time. Dr. Biggs, does that strike you as a constructive way to deal with some of these issues in terms of making sure that everyone has a decent retirement?
Well, I think we're not here in the minimum wage. The research in the minimum wage, I think, is more nuanced than many people today think it will. It won't destroy jobs, but right. You know, if you go, I live in Southern Oregon, right on the Northern California border. A $15 minimum wage in those areas would be difficult.
And just so you're clear, I favor the Terry Sewell's approach, which is a regional minimum wage. So in California, $15 is fine for us, but maybe it's different in rural Alabama. But as a way to get up to 15.
My part of thinking about the Save for the Future Act, part of me says, oh, I don't want to have a mandate on businesses to do these certain things. And I understand that. On the other hand, though, I would personally much rather increase retirement savings for those who need it through a personal account type program that you're talking about than trying to do it on the Social Security side, which is, I think, is just much more difficult on the tax end.
Well, I didn't suggest the Social Security side, but three out of 10 workers lack access to a retirement plan today. 45% don't participate. That's not good for the country.
Sure. The coverage gap is two things I'd point out. Close the coverage gap, make auto enrollment universal. That solves so many problems, and it does it in a very easy kind of way.
And finally, I think that the response to Mr. Hanner was a little bit cavalier. My father also had his clergy pension cut. He was so careful with his money. He depended on that pension. He had every right to depend on that pension. And I think speaking in generalities doesn't really address the pain that happens in those families. I want to acknowledge that, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. I am going to talk for a minute to the millennials in the room and to the many millennials glued to C-SPAN right now, watching this, I say sarcastically, watching this extremely important discussion on Social Security. This is going to affect my generation. I am a millennial, albeit an elder millennial. And Social Security is one of the most important issues that my generation faces. We all agree it's on a path to insolvency. Americans aren't saving enough. We aren't secure enough in our retirement. The question is then, what do we do? And we have to frame the options, I think, very clearly. First of all, let's come up with the realization that Social Security is not a retirement program. It is a program meant to keep seniors out of poverty. Originally, its intention. And another thing we should point out is that we actually generally agree on progressive solutions to fix it. But there's two ways to add money into the program in a progressive way. One is through taxation and one is through benefits. So let's look at the Social Security 2100 Act. This represents the extreme end of using tax increases to achieve solvency. Millennials watching C-SPAN should not be very fond of this idea. What we're effectively doing is we're transferring wealth from the young to the old. It's also the least efficient way to redistribute wealth if our goal is indeed that, and I actually think it is. You're taking money out of people's paychecks when they need it most, when they're trying to start a family, start a business, buy a home, or save for retirement, which I think we all agree is a problem. Americans are not saving enough. And according to the 2100 Act, this money would be transferred mostly to wealthy retirees. I hope millennials are listening to this. This is deeply unfair, and it's bad for economic growth. In fact, according to that Wharton study, it decreases economic growth by a whole 2% by 2049. That seems like a small number, but in reality, that's an enormous absolute number. The other way that we can look to make Social Security solvent is, of course, through benefits. So how do we do that? Well, we have to question, does it make sense for the wealthiest among us to have an increase in benefits after they have had their entire lives to save, their entire lives to create the businesses they want to do and create wealth? Does that make sense? Or does it make sense to focus on the true purpose of Social Security, which is to keep senior citizens out of poverty and focus on benefit increases for them? If we're going to be progressive about this, it should be in the latter parts of life. We should not tax the very people who need their money the most, my generation, to transfer that to the wealthy. Okay, don't worry, millennials, we're going to put that on YouTube. I know you're not watching C-SPAN. All right. Mr. Biggs, will you talk for a second about the economic differences between the benefit and taxation debates?
Sure. If I could just touch on the generational differences first. I think you hit on something very important, and this applies to Social Security 2100 Act. Benefits are increased immediately under that proposal. The tax increases are phased in. You know, you can say, well, today it's only a cup of latte or something. Once those tax increases are fully phased in, for an average wage worker, it's an extra $50 a week or $50 a month they have to pay. So it's, when you're increasing benefits immediately, but phasing in the tax increases, it means that future generations of workers, they have to pay for not only their own benefit increase, but for the benefit increase that came to today's retirees who didn't pay for it. So generationally, this is shifting more of the costs to future generations. On the economic side, it is, people disagree about the effect of taxes on work incentives and economic growth. But there is agreement that, in general, if you raise taxes, people are going to work less. We don't know the size, but we know they're going to work less. There also is a lot of research finding for middle and upper income folks that if you raise Social Security benefits, they will save less. Now, in a simple textbook economic model, if people work less because of higher taxes and they save less because of higher benefits, you will, in fact, have a smaller economy in the future. The Penn-Wharton model projects a 7 percentage point of GDP difference come 2049 from the Social Security 2100 Act versus kind of a benefit cuts only act. That is an enormous amount of money that we're giving away, essentially, that we're foregoing, which we could avoid. We can protect the poor, but middle and upper income folks should work more, save more, work a little bit longer.
I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on what my colleague from Texas was saying. He was talking about how there are two ways to address the Social Security crisis. And he said specifically, we can make Social Security solvent through tax increases, or we can make Social Security solvent through benefits. It seems to me that what he meant to say was cutting benefits. Is that right, Mr. Biggs, Dr. Biggs?
You would be cutting benefits certainly relative to promised levels. You would not necessarily be cutting them relative to the benefits that today's retirees get, because Social Security promises ever increasing real levels of benefits. So it's just a distinction. It does not mean future retirees would have lower benefits than today. It's one of these Washington things, slowing the growth equals a cut.
Right, so it's cut.
Sure.
It's not increasing benefits. What sorts of benefits do you think that we should be cutting to achieve solvency through this method?
Okay, well, for middle and upper income retirees, I would slow the rate at which benefits increase. And the idea there is they should make up that difference, and the evidence suggests they will make up that difference by saving more in their 401ks, delaying retirement a little bit.
Saving more in their 401ks.
Correct.
What percentage of Americans have 401ks?
Right now,
What percentage of Americans have 401ks?
about 55%.
About 55%. And would you say those are the poorest Americans who have 401ks?
No, those are the middle and upper income folks. Who are
Those are the
expected to
upper
save
income
more.
folks, the middle and upper income folks. Okay, but I thought Mr. Crenshaw said that Social Security was designed to keep people out of poverty. Are upper income folks in danger of going into poverty?
No, which is why you would slow the growth of benefits for them.
Okay, but so the point is that you said that by slowing the growth of benefits, you'd encourage people to put more money into their 401ks.
Exactly.
But those aren't the people who need Social Security. The people who need Social Security
I think
are the people who are at the lower income scale. Is that not right, Dr. Biggs?
Sure, you're making my case for
So,
me. We should retain
your
benefits
colleague-
at the lower end, but
your
slow
colleague-
them for middle upper income folks.
So your colleague my colleague from Oklahoma stated that most Americans aren't counting on Social Security right now. Would you say that that's true?
It's a little hard to say.
It's a little hard to say?
I wish they were saving as if they were not going to get Social Security.
That's a nice wish, but are they counting on it? Would you like to tell my parents that they're not counting on Social Security?
I think he was referring to younger folks who say, I'm more likely to
Oh, did
see
he
a
specify
UFO."
younger folks?
Well, we had a previous reference to a poll of younger folks who said they're more likely to see a UFO than get Social Security, so I think he was referencing that, yes, sir.
Okay, so we should just assume that Social Security won't be there.
No.
And why don't we just eliminate it?
In response to a previous question, I said as long as Social Security is collecting 12.4% of payroll, it can continue paying benefits equal to 12.4% of payroll from now until infinity. It will not run out of money, and it is mistaken for younger folks to think they'll get zero. That is an error on their part.
That is an error. All right.
Sure.
How do you suggest that we deal with the gig economy vis-a-vis Social Security?
Dr. Favreau touched on this earlier. There's a question of people who are gig-only works, who they might work for Uber as their only job. And then
And by the way, if they work for Uber, I mean, we talk about how low unemployment is right now. It seems to me I've met an awful lot of Americans who are working 2 or 3 jobs who are just barely struggling to make ends meet, teachers who are driving Uber in the evenings to put food on the table. We just had a court ruling that Uber employees aren't even considered employees.
If you follow the IRS standards for who is a contractor and who's an employee, I mean, this is neither here nor there for me.
Well,
Pretty clearly
neither here nor there for you. It's
it-
here or there for an awful lot of Americans who are counting on Social Security because they're struggling to make ends meet.
The status
Dr.
of
Biggs.
Uber employees is neither here nor there for me. It is not the subject of my testimony, sir.
Well, maybe it should be, because we've got to figure out how to make Social Security. Well, I'm glad you think this is a laughing matter, Dr. Biggs.
I was
'Cause
asked
I'm not
to testify
sure.
on retirement,
I'm not
not
sure
on
it's
the
a laughing matter for an awful lot of Americans. I'm not sure it's a laughing matter for that teacher who doesn't have a pension anymore, who has to drive Uber in the evening to put food on the table. I don't think that's a laughing matter at all. And I don't think the idea that a lot of Americans aren't counting on Social Security is something that we should count on here in Congress. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield the first 60 seconds of my time to Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. Mr. Moulton, I'll help answer your question since you didn't want to direct it at me. I don't think this is as helpful to your presidential run as you might think, trying to twist words and mix up the numbers here. What we are saying is a basic notion of fairness. If you have to solve the problem of Social Security in a progressive way, which I think we actually agree on, what is the fairest way to do it? Do you want to increase benefits for millionaires? That's the essential question. And your answer to that is yes, you do. Some progressive. It doesn't make sense and it's bad for the economy. That's the answer. But I know you were looking for sound bites for your failing presidential run. Good luck with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Biggs, so I want to begin with 1935. So the average life expectancy was around 60 years old. 16 people were paying in for every one person taking out. And the retirement age at that point was 65. We were coming out of the Great Depression. And America did what America does, and that is help people that needed to be helped. Would you say that there was a retirement crisis in 1935?
There were very, very few retirement plans, either in the public or the private sector. At that point, most retirees, those who lived to retirement age, would depend on families. So by today's standards, there certainly would have been.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 2019. The retirement age is 67, average life expectancy is 80. You have 3 people paying in for every 1 person taking out. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. The economy's doing great. Would you say that there is a retirement crisis today?
There is undoubtedly not a retirement crisis today. Retiree incomes are the highest they've been. Retiree wealth is the highest been. Retiree poverty is the lowest it's been. You can look at surveys. Retirees will tell you they have enough money not simply to survive, but to live comfortably. It doesn't mean that we don't have cases where retirees are in poverty or they have health cost problems or other financial problems. But it means that relative to the past, retirees today are doing very, very well. We should acknowledge that success and celebrate it while still preparing for the challenges ahead.
So would you say that Social Security is not doing what it was designed to do in 2019?
Well, Social Security, if you think about the decline in the poverty rate among retirees, which we have seen, Social Security is playing a role in that, in the sense you're boosting benefits for folks at the low end. The question is it sustainable over the long term? Is it focused where it should be? The issue is not that Social Security isn't helping prevent poverty, it's spending a lot of money on a lot of higher income people who are at no risk of poverty. And I think that's the question of, should we be raising taxes to increase those benefits, or should we use that money elsewhere?
If nothing is done to change Social Security as it is now, will I receive benefits like my father does today?
You will receive benefits. You will not. They may, depending on your earnings versus your dad, they may be higher in sort of inflation-adjusted terms. You will not receive the benefits you've been promised. You would receive roughly 20% less than you've been promised. So could you survive? Probably. Is that a good system to have? No, it's not. And so we need to get on top of this problem rather than leaving it to the night before the system goes broke.
And again, what year is, will the 20% cuts take effect?
It's currently projected by the Social Security Administration for 2035. I think the CBO projects it a little bit earlier than that, a year or so earlier.
I think we can all agree that if we send people 20% less than they received the previous year, in 2035, it will be very bad for everyone.
That will be a crisis.
And that would indeed be a crisis. So the question then becomes, what are we going to do that is responsible to fix it? And it is, will we change the plan that I will have, that I can expect, begin the education process to make sure that people in my generation understand how to appropriately plan for retirement, and also potentially find a way to increase the amount of money that is going into the system. So the answer is likely going to be somewhere between both of those approaches. Would you agree with that?
Sure. Americans, workers and retirees have earned benefits under Social Security. We can afford to pay the benefits people have already earned. We can fix Social Security without cutting benefits you've already accrued. But going forward, the terms of the deal have to change. We have to tell people, going forward, you're going to have to pay a little bit more or get a little bit less. We can pay what people have already earned. We cannot continue an unsustainable deal going forward, though.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you holding this hearing today, and I look forward to working with you to try to fix Social Security for the next generation.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to yield some time to Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Ms. Omar. I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Crenshaw's comments. After saying that we could solve the Social Security deficit through benefits while conveniently leaving out the word cutting benefits, he then said that what I want to do is raise benefits for millionaires. And I assume he's referring to the fact that I'm a co-sponsor of the Social Security 2100 Act that does increase benefits for Social Security recipients. So I just have one simple question. Dr. Favreau, are most Social Security recipients millionaires?
They certainly are not.
Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you. Let's continue on that thought. Social Security was designed to elevate seniors from poverty. Half of our nation's seniors were in poverty in 1935 when this happened. And right now, yes, so we can celebrate some wins, is about 8.8%. But that isn't really the case for women. Do you know what the percentage of women is?
It depends which particular statistic you use, but usually women's poverty is substantially higher than men's, somewhere between 80% and 100% higher, depending on which statistics you use.
Yeah, and I suppose this is twice as high as men. Also, women of color have higher. And what is that due to? So
predominantly, if you look at the statistics, and I cited some in my testimony, it's low lifetime earnings, right? We know that women face, first of all, African-American women or women of color, by and large, will often face discrimination in the labor market. So in addition to oftentimes working less because they're providing care, they may be facing discrimination in the labor market. So that compounds over the course of a lifetime, and so that one can end up with lower lifetime earnings, and that would in turn lead to lower lifetime benefits. So it's a combination of oftentimes caregiving, it can be poor labor market experiences, so a wide range of phenomena.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can focus on trying to fix Social Security, but I believe that we also can do some work in trying to support other policies that will get rid of the kind of disparities that exist for many of our seniors in our communities. So things like the Family Paid Leave Act, would certainly be helpful. Are there any other policies that you think would be able to help fill the gap?
So one policy that I think is important to look at, and this is for people very low on the income spectrum, is to look at the Supplemental Security Income Program, which I think is often referred to as the forgotten safety net. That's the backstop to Social Security for those folks who have very low incomes and very low assets. That program has not been updated in decades with respect to its asset test, so that is definitely one area I would look. I think it's a forgotten component of our safety net, and it needs some modernization. So that's one idea, but certainly.
Yeah. So, Dr. Biggs, I just wanted to get a clear understanding on the testimony that the answers you were giving to the questions my colleague was asking from Texas. You're proposing that we have the wealthiest seniors get less in Social Security than those that are in the lower income brackets.
Not necessarily less in dollar terms, but less than they're currently promised.
Okay.
You know, they're promised some level, I would have them get less than that.
Right, because what's the thought process around that? They have money, they shouldn't be supplemented more.
The idea is that if you reduce their future benefits, they will respond by working and saving more. Lower income folks, it's much harder to do that. And so you should focus the benefit reductions on the folks who can most bear it.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite progressive, I would say, and it's fascinating to me because there's often hypocrisy from my colleague when it comes to taxation. I seem to think that you should tax people with higher income brackets, the millionaires, the billionaires, higher, and make sure that you are putting more money back in the pockets of people who are struggling with poverty or are in the lower income brackets. I also believe that we should be helping house people who are homeless and are struggling in our communities, that we should care for our children and make sure that we're providing for education and the such. And it's fascinating to me because none of those things he agrees with. But when it comes to retirement and talking about millennials, that's where he goes. When you yourself have said, as millennials can still count on getting Social Security benefits, we are paying into it, we will be promised that. But what we are not promised is that when we take on student debt, we are not promised to have a job that will be able to pay us enough to be able to pay off those student loans. We're not promised the kind of future we want in buying a home, in starting a family, and having a children, and having the kind of security and dignity that we deserve. We are not promised the kind of health care that is going to care for us when we get things like diabetes or cancer. Those are the kind of promises that we don't get, and those are the kind of promises that people cannot have the income or the ability to fill the gap for. We cannot show up for ourselves in a different way. And so I just,
Chairman,
really
her time
love to
expired.
see that kind
Time
of
has expired.
hypocrisies. Thank you, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've missed the testimony, but candidly, Ms. Cooke, I came for you. I know where I stand on Social Security. It's the easiest and most predictable crisis we face. Candidly, I would pick any of the solutions you all proffered rather than none of the solutions that you all proffered. And it's a great frustration to me that we're here. I appreciate the distinction you make, Dr. Biggs, between providing folks with more benefits that they don't need versus taking more money away from them that they might need. I consider that a substantially different use of the federal power to give people less as opposed to take more from them. Biggest disappointment I've had in Congress was the super committee back in 2011 that failed to make any substantial movement on these issues, Ms. Cooke. But second biggest disappointment was the pension committee last year. Bipartisan, bicameral committee had a real shot at being able to put folks who are dealing with Central States in a place of certainty going forward. What I hear from my pensioners back home is, Rob, maybe I'm going to take a haircut. Maybe it's a big haircut. Maybe it's a little haircut. But I'd rather know today so I can take my wife on that vacation before we get too old to do it instead of not know. I've served with these two gentlemen on the budget bicameral bipartisan committee. Found amazing understanding and productive conversation in that way. Didn't hear any of that coming out of the pension committee. Tell me what your expectation is if we can't agree to be candid with a small group like folks trusting Central States. How do you see us going to even a larger group like all senior citizens and being candid with them about our Social Security challenges going forward?
Congressman, do you mind if it was actually my colleague over here that talked about the Central State pensions.
I came all this way for you, Ms. Cooke, and you're pointing me to Mr. Hanner instead.
I'd be happy to answer another question.
I was prepared to trust Ms. Cooke's answer. I'm a little more skeptical now, Mr. Hanner. Go, please.
Well, when you talk about dealing with them and the small haircut you're talking about over 60% of that pension. That's not a haircut.
You've misunderstood what I've said. Today, there is no certainty. Except that folks cannot have the benefits that they've been promised.
Right.
You and I, and the chairman, the ranking member, we could create certainty. Now, that certainty is not going to be that you get everything that was promised. It's certainly not for the next generation of retirees. It's not going to be you got everything the previous generation got. But what we can do is promise you that you are going to get something. 90%, 70%, 60%, whatever it is, we can solve the uncertainty if we come together on that issue. My question, as someone who's facing that uncertainty, is: do you value certainty at a cost more than the uncertainty, which, while it may not have a cost today, is certainly going to have an associated cost tomorrow?
Yes, we value certainty. We would have to look at the cost.
And that is the conversation I have with all of my colleagues about Social Security. We should fix it. We'll just have to look and see what that ought to look like. And candidly, Mr. Chairman, you're the first one to take a serious look at what we can do to come together. It might not have been the look I would have taken first, but I'll take a look over no look at all. Mr. Hanner?
But you also got to remember, certainty means a lot to us. We paid to insure these pensions, and now you're telling us that's broke too.
Well, to be fair, the insurance was never a full insurance, right? I can sign you. I can connect you with the folks in my district who are on pensions that were insured. They're not satisfied with the quality of that insurance.
Yeah, they're not.
But
we were never brought into that. That was between the company and Congress.
Let me ask you a different question. Big group in my district, UPS, as you know, paid big dollars to buy their Teamsters out of Central States many years ago. Now folks want to come back and say, well, we know you paid what you owed, but other folks didn't pay what they owed, and so now we want to come back and get some more from UPS. I think that's a fair concern on the Social Security perspective as well. I want to solve the problem, whether it means I pay more or I get less, however it is. Those are the only levers I can pull. Let's pull those levers. But I want the certainty that we're going to do it once, we're going to agree on what that solution is, and now we're going to be actuarially satisfied for the next 3 generations. Knowing that everyone here is in favor of solutions, is there any upside to a temporary fix instead of a multi-generational solve? No benefit for a short-term solution. I just share that with you, Mr. Chairman. Not that you advocate for short-term solutions, but this Congress does have a penchant for solving something for another 60 or 90 days. Zero interest across the ideological spectrum for doing something that's not going to be enduring. I look forward to working with you on an enduring solution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving us the opportunity to address this very critical issue, which affects millions of seniors and retirees, and one that will affect all of us one day. Before I go any further, I want to thank our primary witness this morning, Congressman Larson, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Social Security from the Ways and Means Committee. He recently joined me for a Social Security town hall in my district to speak to our constituents about the urgent need for Congress to act, to preserve, protect, and improve Social Security in the future, and to strengthen all retirement security. Social Security has and continues to be a safety net for families across Southern Nevada and across the country. Social Security provides benefits to 400,000 Nevada retired workers, of which nearly 100,000 are in Nevada's 4th Congressional District, which I represent. One of the things that my constituents relate to me is they have serious concerns about the future of Social Security. Many of them express that they fear any cuts to their benefits, which they rely on to survive each and every month. And this is one of the reasons why I support the Social Security 2100 Act, which was introduced by Congressman John Larson. To quote Maria Dent, the state director in Nevada for AARP, Nevadans earn their benefits through a lifetime of hard work. As a result, it insures families against the loss of income caused by retirement, disability, or death. Without Social Security benefits, about 4 in 10 Americans aged 65 and older would have incomes below the poverty line. All else being equal according to official estimates based on the 2017 current population survey. Let me be clear, Social Security is not an entitlement. It is a trust fund that people have paid into their entire working life. It's a false choice, in my opinion, to have a discussion about cutting benefits for current or future beneficiaries. And it's time for Congress to take the responsible steps necessary to shore up Social Security now for current and future beneficiaries. Now, the president's proposed budget would drastically cut programs that benefit America's oldest, including many vulnerable citizens. The president's spending plan calls for deep reductions to Social Security disability insurance, breaking his promise not to touch Social Security. It also includes cuts in Medicare, another program he promised not to cut. According to the Federal Reserve Board, Social Security accounts for a greater share of retirement income for African American, Latino American, and Asian Americans than it does for the general population. And African American and Latino retirees are about half as likely to have private retirement plans and are significantly less likely to have savings through an IRA or a 401k, which I suppose is the only solution my colleagues on the other side are willing to support. Ms. Cooke, Ms. Favreau, Dr. Favreau, and Mr. Hamner, can you confirm that retirement and financial security is a stressor for many seniors today, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Mrs. Cooke, can you please discuss the impacts that any cuts to Social Security would have on the more than 15 million elderly Americans and 130,000 Nevada residents aged 65 and older? What would happen to benefits if trust fund reserves are depleted?
It would have a devastating effect, and we already see older adults in poverty. From where I come from, Rochester, New York, and we have the highest percentage of older adults in poverty in New York State. And I have to say, you touched upon a group of individuals who are most affected, women, people of color, and certainly women of color. And we see them barely getting by each day. So any cut to Social Security would throw millions, I believe, of older adults into poverty.
Yeah, so disproportionately those who live on the brink of poverty, with nearly half of all older Black and Latino retirees at or below the 200% poverty threshold.
That's correct.
These are the people we're talking about. We will not allow those cuts to happen, not on our watch. And it is time for this Congress to take the action necessary to pass the Social Security 2100 Act so that we can shore up Social Security for current and future beneficiaries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I thank you for holding this hearing. It is an important hearing, and it is a hearing that we should be committed to doing something about. One thing is certain is that we cannot improve our fiscal outlook by gutting Americans' retirement security. It heretofore has been Social Security, savings, and pension. But it would be immoral to try to solve our long-term budget challenges on the backs of retirees. Our commitment to building a new infrastructure, whatever the bells and whistles that we would like to do to make America the greatest country that it is, nothing should cause us to do it on the back of retirees, pensioners, their savings, or Social Security. But we have seen in this administration a constant effort with a long and unbroken history of calling for cuts to Social Security, along with our friends, the other side of the aisle, and other programs vital to seniors' economic well-being. I've been here in the Congress when there was a rage to do privatization. Privatization in the midst of the greatest financial collapse, probably worse because of the wealth in this country than the Great Depression, though I know that there will be stories to try to overcome that. What would have happened if we had yielded to the investment of our Social Security into private entities? I'm very pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of the HR 2100, early co-sponsors of Mr. Larson's legislation that really focuses on strengthening Social Security, and also a sponsor of my own Social Security Dividend Safety Act that indicates where there is no COLA, there should be a dividend given to senior citizens. But we hope that the legislation that Mr. Larson has put forward will move in this Congress, both the House and the Senate. Mrs. Cooke, what would an immediate 20% cut to Social Security benefits mean to retirees? What trade-offs and choices would they be forced to make?
Well, what I see every single day, because I work with older adults, they would have the devastating choice of paying for prescription drugs, paying for the utilities, or what we see paying for food. And earlier, one of the congressmen mentioned, and we see this too, that by the end of the month, we have to direct older adults to food kitchens and pantries because they can't make it right now. So I can't imagine they could even survive with a 20% cut.
Like me, you have seen choices of cat and dog food being supplanted for real food. You've seen parceling out of medicine, not taking the right amount, which obviously we know is like not taking any at all.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, what ended up happening is many of those older adults end up in the hospital paying more in just a different pocket because they're not taking their adequate prescription drugs.
Let me ask you all of you a question, starting with Mr. Hanner about pension. My union friends who have worked and invested and have these pensions that they thought and prayed and supported that would keep them through their later stages. Many of them work with their hands as well as their minds, but they work for 30, 40 years, and they work hard. So, Mr. Hanner, what kinds of choices that families at risk of losing their pension have to face? Are people worried about losing their homes or not being able to pay for their medicine they need? Or as many who are young pensioners worrying about what to do about their college-age children wanting to go to college, and they thought they had a nest egg and enough to protect themselves. Could you please tell us more about how the widows of pensioners are hurting as well, and how crucial it is to shore up pensions?
So I'll read it again. Okay. The key thing you've talked about is the worrying part. People are very worried about losing their homes. Their homes are probably the biggest assets they have. And this is their sanctuary. And when you lose your home, you're homeless. And this is probably the final straw for most people. This is probably the one that they couldn't take. that, yeah, they worry about the medical bill, the taxes, being able to look after the children, and you know, the stuff that they've been promised. They worked for 35 years, and they put their part in, and they're expecting a return on what they've done. They've paid in. These are deferred wages that they're not getting back, and there's a big feeling that you're being stolen from.
That's a good, that is a good equation, if you will. You're equating the right kind of feeling that I would have for my constituents, that they're being stolen from, and they have no way of catching the thief.
And what you said about the widows, this is our most vulnerable section in Central States, is the widows, because they only get, you know, half of a pension. If together they had made that decision before you retire, you make that decision together that whether you want survivor benefits or not, and you give up 15% of your pension if you want survivor benefits. And there's a lot of cases where together they've made the decision to forego the survivor benefits. So upon death, the pension stops.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you.
Let me thank the witnesses.
Now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here on such an important topic. Just to your point, I always think that, you know, Social Security is often called an entitlement. It really should be called an earned benefit program, because that's what it is. It's not an entitlement. So thank you for that powerful testimony. In my state, we know that Social Security is crucial for older people, as it is across the country. Without Social Security benefits in Washington state, an estimated 317,000 more Washington state seniors would fall below the poverty line. And across the country, more than 15 million older adults stay out of poverty because of Social Security. I have a graph there that sort of shows all of the states. Might have come from one of you, actually. Thank you, if someone prepared that. And Social Security benefits are especially important for Black and Latino seniors and for women, as we heard you testify, Mrs. Cooke. We also know that Social Security would work even better if people with high incomes paid their fair share, and that's kind of what I want to focus on today. Everyone who works pays a percentage of their income into Social Security, but only up to the point of $132,900. So people who earn over $132,900 get special treatment. Everything that they earn over that amount isn't taxed anymore. They get, in my words, a special cap. And so I thought about two hypothetical people, Dana and Donald. And I've got Dana's information here. And for those of you who can't see the slide, I'll just show you right here. So Dana lives in Seattle. And when she started working, she earns the Seattle per capita income, which is $51,872. Then she unionizes her workplace. Her income goes up to the Seattle median, which is $79,565. And then she gets promoted, and she eventually earns $132,000. We are so proud of Dana. Does Dana pay into Social Security at the same percentage, even as her income changes, Ms. Favreau?
Yes, because she's below the cap.
Correct. So she pays that same 6.2% every step of the way. All right, now let's go to Donald. So now we have Donald. Donald earns $150,000. He works at his dad's company. Then he moves over to work for a for-profit university, and his salary goes up to $400,000. And then he works at a company that makes ties and steaks, where his pay is about $1 million a year. And again, this is just hypothetical. Does Donald have to pay 6.2% of his income on all of these earnings the way that Dana does, Ms. Favreau?
No, he only pays to the cap.
He only pays to the $132,000. So what that means, and you can see it on this slide, is that Donald is not paying, when he's earning $150,000, he's not paying taxes on 11% of that income. As he goes up to $1 million, he's not paying on 86% of his income, correct? Correct. Okay. My hypothetical situation is right so far. So what that means is that Donald is paying actually 0.0829% of his total income versus Dana, who is paying the 6.2% of her total income. Is that correct, Ms. Favreau?
Can't do the math on the fly, but I'm going to trust you.
And anybody disagree with that characterization? Okay, so if we were to hypothetically raise the cap or scrap the cap, then people would actually be paying the same percentage on their entirety of their income, correct? Okay, so as a national expert on the economic security of aging adults, Ms. Favreau, how would our Social Security system improve if all of Donald's pay was actually taxed at the same rate as Dana? Donald and Dana earn money, they both do well, but they get taxed the same way. They pay their fair share. How would that change our Social Security system?
So if we were to immediately and permanently lift the cap entirely, the relative savings for the Social Security program in terms of the reduction in the actuarial imbalance would be between 68 and roughly 83%, depending on whether you paid benefits or didn't pay benefits on those additional contributions.
So it would have a substantial effect if you scrapped it entirely, but you could also raise it slightly, and because it's such a big system with so many people, even a small increase in the cap would make an enormous difference. So I would like to, and would women and Black and Latino seniors who experience disproportionate poverty benefit from scrapping that cap?
So I think in general, it's important that we definitely look at raising the cap for the very reason that then folks, particularly more vulnerable retirees, would be less vulnerable to benefit reductions subsequently. So yes, I think it's an important part of a solution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's why I support legislation like Representative Larson's Social Security 2100 Act. And I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this excellent report by Ms. Favreau and Owen G. Haga on validating the longitudinal earnings and dynamic microsimulation models.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member.
I thank the chairman. We've had a great hearing. I'm sorry that occasionally things get a little acrimonious in here, but this is a very important subject, and it has been centric on Social Security today, as I anticipated it would. But before I get into my questions, I want to go to Dr. Biggs here for just a minute. Ms. Jayapal, my distinguished colleague from Washington, just threw out some hypotheticals, Dana and Donald, kind of left out some important features of the purpose of Social Security, what it's designed to do, and the relationship between the percentage that is being paid on income and the benefits that accrue to the recipient at some point in time, 62, 65, 67, whatever that time frame is. Did I miss something?
When Franklin Roosevelt and his team during the Depression, when they built the Social Security program, they were very well aware of this kind of math. And the reason they put a cap on the Social Security taxes, $132,000 today, was to distinguish Social Security from what they then called relief, or what we would today call welfare. We talk about Social Security as an earned benefit. If you eliminate the cap, to be frank, whether you're paying additional benefits or you're not, the finance of the system becomes so redistributive. You have people on top paying so much more in than they could possibly expect to get back, that it violates what Roosevelt thought as people having a reasonable balance between what they pay and what they receive. That, in turn, people would start calling it welfare. Now, I am personally not against the idea of a highly redistributive pension program to focus on the people in need, but we need to be aware of that's, in fact, what you're doing. And Social Security, when Roosevelt's administration first looked at Social Security, their original proposal, people with earnings above that cap wouldn't even participate in the program. There would be no redistribution. Their compromise was, well, they'll be in, but they'll only pay up to a certain amount, and they'll only earn benefits on earnings above that amount. So somebody making $1 million gets no more Social Security benefits than somebody making $132,000. So it is not just a tax. We have to think about the program and what it's intended to look at on both the tax and the benefit side.
So in Ms. Jayapal's analysis, the fact that they pay the same amount up to $132,700, whatever that number is, the proportionate amount that they would accrue in terms of benefits, is basically tied to the amount that they are paying in.
Exactly.
And that, so under her scenario, if we were to lift that cap, then what would happen to the accrued benefit of the high-income earner? And what would that do to the concept of Social Security? I think you've kind of answered that, but I'm going to give you another chance.
So this gets to the idea we had earlier of, are we favoring paying higher benefits to millionaires and billionaires? And if you want to keep Social Security as an earned benefit, an earnings-related system, if you eliminate that cap, you have to pay additional benefits. You will be paying higher benefits to those folks. The question is, how do they view it? Do they think it becomes welfare? Does it weaken support for the system? And one of the things Roosevelt thought, and which most people, I think, still continue to be true, is because it's not seen as a welfare program, it's seen as an earned benefit. Social Security has survived and had political resiliency in ways that other programs that are seen as welfare don't. So I think it's important to keep that balance. I mean, we can adjust it, but it's to recognize that it's not just a no-brainer that people should pay 12.4% of all their earnings. Roosevelt was a smart guy, and he didn't think you should do that.
With the ranking member.
I'd be happy to yield. Yes, ma'am.
This is a good line of questioning, and I appreciate it. I was just curious whether, when the program was established, whether you think there's any merit to the question of what that cap should be. In those days, I don't think we had a lot of millionaires and billionaires in the same extent that we do today. The wealth inequality today hasn't been the same since 1920. So I just am curious, if the ranking member permits, for anybody's thoughts on this, because we are in a vastly different economy today where you could argue that our taxation system and many other factors have created this tremendous inequality. And so I appreciate the ranking member's questioning. I'm just curious whether there are other factors that you might want to consider as you look at this cap, given the dramatic difference between today and when it was established.
When Social Security began, I believe the payroll tax ceiling was set so that around, Melissa may know, correct me if I'm wrong, but sorry, Dr. Favreau, I think around 90% of total earnings were subject to Social Security payroll taxes. It is now, today, it is about 84, 85%. So a common proposal is let's lift the cap to cover 90% again. That might take it to, I don't know, 185, maybe $200,000. But they understood. I mean, in 1920s, 1930s, there was a lot of income inequality then, and they got it. But it's just thinking about how you want to balance this and how it's perceived. But it's also, if you think there are other uses for federal money, if you want to do Medicare for all, if you want to have more money for infrastructure, once you eliminate that Social Security tax cap, as I joked earlier, but it's in fact true, you would be at Scandinavian levels of taxation. Top tax rates, my guess, including state taxes, would come in around 62%.
But it's important to understand who's paying that
Sure.
increase. The increase goes to a very tiny, tiny, tiny portion, depending on how you structure it.
Yeah, I've been very generous with my time.
You have,
so
and I thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.
I'm going to reclaim my time. And I know the ranking member, him being the great guy from the Commonwealth of Kentucky that he is, will give me another minute if I need it. Look, I want to carry this conversation back to the idea of Social Security and its origin and what it was designed to do, and how far away from that, particularly with a lot of very vulnerable seniors today, that we have gotten from that it is the only source of income for a large number of people. Ms. Favreau, why is that? Why do so many people have only Social Security as their income?
So I think a big component of this is low lifetime earnings, right? There are a lot of people who just aren't able to accrue a lot of earnings over the course of their lifetime. It can be for a variety of reasons.
And I'm a big fan of asking the question why. In fact, when I talk to young people today, I challenge them to ask why on a lot of those. So why have people been destined to a lifetime of low earnings?
So often it can be a lack of investment in education, but often there's just, a distribution of skills across the population. So I think the more we invest in education, certainly, the more likely people will have higher lifetime earnings. Also, things happen to people. Of course, disability happens, caregiving happens, and we know partly women's lifetime earnings tend to be much lower than men's lifetime earnings by and large because they're taking care of kids, they're taking care of the grandparents when they get sick. So there's definitely a lot of reasons why we understand low lifetime earnings. As I mentioned earlier, there's the issues of discrimination in the labor market, and those are things that I think are really important that we need to consider as well.
And some of those things we have been able to address over time, and so we have been able to fix some issues, but we still have an alarming number of people, I think, that are relying only on Social Security as their primary source of income when they hit retirement age. And I believe that that's contributing to the problem. And you're right, some bad things happen to good people, health-related issues and those kinds of things. But we also have a lot of people that are making some very poor decisions with their lives, be it things like drugs and alcohol or, matters, that involve criminal conduct. We have people that are making terrible health-related decisions that are contributing to a higher cost to living later on in life. And so, I just think there's a cacophony of reasons why we have people that are reliant on Social Security. But I want to go back to Dr. Biggs because earlier in the hearing, and a number of my colleagues were not here to hear this, you discussed how you would be handling this issue with regard to the higher income people and the lower income people, and you were specific about wanting to do a better job of handling the people on the low economic spectrum as opposed to the distribution of benefits throughout.
If I could generalize, the difference between sort of conservative, quote, Social Security reform plans and progressive reform plans isn't in how they treat low-income people. Some of the provisions to boost benefits for low earners that are contained in Social Security 2100 Act came from conservative plans authored by Republicans. The issue isn't how you treat the poor. The issue is, do we want to raise taxes on middle and higher income people in order to pay higher benefits to middle and higher income people, or do we want to hold the line on their taxes and tell them you're going to have to save more on your own and work longer? I would bet my life if you were to put this question to people and say, would you rather pay more money into Social Security to get higher benefits, or would you rather pay more money into your 401k or IRA to get more money from that? Vast majorities would rather save that money on their own. So the point here is not do we betray the people at the bottom. We have an obligation for them. That's what Social Security was created for. But it was not created to be paying $40,000 a year to somebody who made $130,000 every year of his life. We need to refocus our resources.
And as I conclude, Mr. Chairman, I would just say this. So much of what we have facing our country involves the education of people. And I believe we're not doing as good a job as we could, particularly in some of our educational institutions, of helping young people understand that they're not going to be 18 or 19 years of age forever. There's going to be a day that their hair is going to be the color of mine or maybe even gone. The fact is, if we all expect to live a long life and we want to live a long life, but at some point in time we're not going to be work eligible anymore and we're going to have to retire. And so to think that they would be able to hit those ages and only have Social Security and be able to live a comfortable lifestyle, I think would be a misrepresentation of reality. So I appreciate the hearing. We got a lot of work to do, and there's some things that we can do on a bipartisan, and it's going to have to be bipartisan if it's going to be successful. And I hope to be engaged in those conversations. I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. I now yield myself 10 minutes for questions. This relates a little bit to what the ranking member was just saying, but several years ago, my pollster was telling me that when she polled voters as to their top issue, the issues that they were most concerned about, most pollsters, she said, don't put retirement security in the poll. They put jobs in the economy, they put so forth and so on, healthcare. But she said, when I put retirement security in the poll, it always polls number one. And she said, interestingly, it polls most strongly with younger voters. And it's not because they don't think that they're ever going to get the benefit. It's because they don't want their parents moving in with them. Which was, I thought, quite an interesting perspective. But this clearly is an extremely important topic, not just because I'm now well into past 65, but because it is a national challenge and it is an ongoing challenge for our fiscal health, as I said earlier. We've had some difference of opinion, I think, between Dr. Biggs and others about how much retirement security there is in the country, and that, as Dr. Biggs contended, there's assets and contributions are higher than ever, and he cited that as evidence that most people are secure. But total and average assets and contributions can grow even if most Americans are not well prepared for retirement. The wealthiest Americans may be skewing those distributions. Do you think that the income inequality that we've been talking about is playing a role in skewing these statistics and hiding disparities in retirement security, Dr. Favreau?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical when we look at these sort of statistics that we look not just at the mean, but also at the full distribution, because, and this goes back to the issue of the cap and why less earnings are now being covered by Social Security, is the fact that we've had so much explosion at the very top of the earnings distribution. I think it's really important we need to take a look at that. That does skew the statistics, so it's really valuable to look at medians, quintiles, the whole distribution.
Thank you. Dr. Biggs, several years ago, we did something very important with Social Security. We corrected what I considered to have been a terrible mistake in Social Security, and that was that it allowed beneficiaries to defer their retirement, or their taking their benefits to age 70, and they got an 8% a year bonus for that. And it occurred to me, and I'm now benefiting from that, by the way, it occurred to me that that was exactly the wrong incentive, because the only people who can afford to do that are the people who don't need the bonus. The only people who could afford to retire and not take their benefits for 4 more years. We have a system now that allows you to retire earlier. To take your benefits before you're actually eligible for retirement. Do you think that causes problems in any respect? I haven't thought through that, but I'd like to know.
Thanks. If I could first just touch on the issue of, using averages and whether that skews things. I know that came up earlier in the hearing. I cited recent Federal Reserve research that came out a couple months ago, finding that the shift from defined benefit pensions, the traditional pensions, to 401ks has not appreciably changed the distribution of retirement wealth or retirement savings. It has increased retirement savings. The level of savings has increased. The distribution of it hasn't really changed very much. So this is a case where I'm not trying to skew with averages. I mean, the rich always do save more, partly because they're rich, but partly because they get a lower replacement rate from Social Security. But if you've got a higher level of savings today, which we do, with a similar distribution of savings to what we had in the past, that in fact means that low and middle class people are better off in terms of their savings than they were under traditional pensions. Similarly, when I cited the Census Bureau research showing a significant decline in poverty among over 65 Americans over the last 20 years, about 1/3, almost 1/3 decline in the share in poverty, that's not from millionaires and billionaires getting richer, that's from poor people having higher incomes. So I'd really encourage people to look at the numbers and the data in my testimony. I'm not saying there are not problems, but those problems are much, much more isolated than people think. We're doing a lot of things right. Thinking on the retirement age, I am not against the delayed retirement credit for older, people work past 65 or 67. I mean, you may be right in terms of some present value sense it compensates them. Where I think we may have made an error in the past was lowering the Social Security retirement age from 65 to 62. If you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, when we had people working on farms, factories, mines, the average person didn't claim benefits till past 65. If you go back to 1950, I think the average Social Security retirement age was 68. So the idea that we can't work longer is belayed by the fact that we, in fact, did work longer. Once we lowered that 65 to 62, so many people claimed it. There's research that came out last year showing because so many more people claimed those early reduced benefits, that increased poverty in retirement by a significant amount. So I know it's hard to say to people, you have to work a little bit longer, but giving them early benefits with that big cut, I think, has been harmful to a lot of folks. So it's a tough choice, but I think on balance, it didn't work out.
Does anybody, any of the other witnesses have a perspective on that? Yes, Dr. Favreau.
I would just add, though, I think with respect to Dr. Biggs' point on the EEA, that we do see that there are significant numbers of people who lose their jobs in their 50s. A lot of shocks happen in your 50s and your 60s, so there are a lot of people who are extremely vulnerable when they're approaching the cap. My colleague Richard Johnson recently did a study, and he saw something on the order of roughly 50% of people are likely to experience a layoff in their 50s, and the overwhelming majority of them, when they're reemployed, they are reemployed at lower wages. So a lot of things happen late career, and I think it's important to keep the early eligibility age as a safety valve.
Is there any data that anyone is aware of about what percentage of people who elect to take benefits at 62 are doing it because they're out of work or because they chose to?
I can't think of data off the top of my head, but there has been a lot of research looking at what causes people to retire early. Things like job loss, things like health problems, the most predominant one. Even amidst that group, though, I don't think that job loss and health issues, I don't think that explains the majority of people who retire early. If you look at early retirees in census data, the current population survey, most of them, even people like age 60 years old, before the early retirement age, who consider themselves retired, they're asked, would you take a job if it were available? The vast majority say no. And so I think you do, probably a lot of retired public employees, but still, it's trying to figure out that end of things. It's not just job loss and health. There are a lot of people voluntarily just choosing to retire early.
Right, they have sufficient, they either have a generous enough pension, they have the savings, they have the opportunity.
In their judgment, they do
that.
yes.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm not going to belabor the hearing. You all have been very patient with your time and with the questions, and we've been over about 2 hours and 40 minutes. So I'm going to conclude now and just advise all the members that they can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. Once again, I thank all of the witnesses, and without objection, this hearing is adjourned.